Tonight, we step quietly into a city where beauty and suffering once lived side by side. The Venice of the plague years was a place unlike any other. Canals wound like veins through stone buildings, masked figures glided by in silence, and behind every ornate doorway lingered the scent of fear. It was a city wrapped in elegance, yet gripped by one of the deadliest diseases the world had ever known. While gondolas still moved across the water and bells rang from distant churches, the rhythm of daily life was slowed, altered, and haunted by something that could not be seen. You are invited now to let your thoughts drift back through time, not to the Venice of romantic postcards, but to the Venice where quarantine was a way of life, where alleyways whispered with suspicion, and where death often arrived by boat. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore what it truly meant to live, suffer, and survive in a city at the edge of medical understanding and on the brink of collapse. We'll walk through plague-infested alleys, peer into masked faces, and sit quietly in candlelit chambers where whispers replace songs. There will be no shouting here, no rushing, only the soft murmur of history unfolding gently around you. So settle in, let your eyes grow heavy, and imagine yourself, just for a moment, drifting on a gondola, mist curling over the water, the city cloaked in silence. Welcome to Plague-Ridden Venice. Chapter 1, Quarantine by Gondola. The slow, silent ride through misty canals as you're ferried to the lazaretto, stripped of identity. And placed in the cold stone isolation rooms, you awaken to the faint creaking of oarlocks, the boat gliding slowly through the dark canal. A fine mist curls just above the waterline, softening the outline of the crumbling buildings that lean inward from both sides. The gondola carries no tourists. There's no laughter, no songs echoing from palazzos. Tonight, it is a vessel of silence. The kind used only for the sick. The kind no one waves at. You sit alone in the gondola, cloaked, your hands tucked under a worn blanket that smells faintly of vinegar and salt. The man rowing you does not speak. He wears a heavy leather mask. Not the feathered kind worn at the carnival, but something more somber, more practical. His eyes are hidden behind dark glass. He will not touch you. When you stepped into the boat, he simply nodded once, then turned back toward the water, guiding the vessel forward with unhurried strokes. The buildings of Venice pass by slowly, their windows shuttered even in daylight now. Cats linger on the edge of bridges, and laundry remains stiff where it hangs, forgotten. The air smells of damp stone and rot, a quiet blend of canal water and antiseptic herbs. Some say the plague can be smelled before it is seen, and you begin to wonder if that earthy bitterness that hangs in your nostrils is something more than mildew. The boat turns, and you glimpse your destination in the distance. A large gray structure stands on its own patch of reclaimed land, just beyond the curve of the city, the lazaretto, a word that once meant sanctuary. Now it means silence, separation, and slow waiting. No matter what illness you carry, or whether you carry it at all, you will be left there, away from others. Not to be treated, but to be observed. As the gondola docks, two figures appear on the pier. They are dressed in heavy robes, their faces hidden behind long-beaked masks. One carries a ledger. The other, a small brass bell that rings softly as you step onto the stone. It is not meant to comfort you. It is meant to warn others. You are now a shadow on a list, no longer a neighbor or citizen. Your name is taken and crossed out with a black line. A number is assigned. Your clothes are removed, burned. You were given a coarse tunic that itches your skin. Your belongings are gone. They will not return. You are led down a narrow passage, past locked rooms where low coughs and murmured prayers seep through the walls. There's no screaming here. That was forbidden long ago. It is too contagious, too disruptive. Even grief has been silenced. The corridor is lit by oil lamps that smoke and flicker, casting strange shapes on the damp stone. Each doorway is marked with chalk, a symbol you don't recognize, but others do. A tally, a warning, a countdown. Your room is small, a bed of straw, a chair, a bucket, a single narrow window too high to see through. A loaf of bread rests on the ledge. It is hard but fresh. The wine beside it is sour but strong. A basin of vinegar water is placed near the door. You're told to wash your hands every hour. You are not told how many hours remain. From the wall beside your bed, you hear the rustling of another patient in the next room. She breathes heavily. Then, nothing. The quiet here is not peaceful. It presses in around you, broken only by distant bells or the scrape of metal on stone. Outside, the water laps gently against the foundations. A reminder that the city is close, yet completely unreachable. You are no longer part of it. The hours begin to blur. You sleep, then wake, then sleep again. The bread is replaced each day, always by unseen hands. A masked figure enters once each morning, says nothing, checks your breath, your eyes, your pulse, then vanishes. Sometimes you hear footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes you don't, and so you wait in the lazaretto, where time slows and identity slips away. Here, in this stone room above the sea, you are no longer yourself. You are a risk, a shadow, a maybe. Your fate lies somewhere between recovery and disappearance. And all you can do is listen to the water, the silence, and the rhythm of a city trying not to die. Inside the walls of the lazaretto, the air remains unnaturally still. The structure itself is practical, undecorated, and built not for healing, but for control. Stone corridors stretch outward like the spokes of a wheel, each leading to different chambers. Some small and windowless, others built to hold entire families who arrived together, only to be separated as soon as symptoms showed. The rooms are stacked along high walls, 2 floors connected by an exterior walkway where the sound of bootsteps echoes endlessly in the late hours of the night. Each door is fitted with a sliding hatch large enough to pass bread or a flask of wine through, but never large enough for an arm. You rarely see the hands that deliver your food, only the sudden motion of cloth and leather as the slot is opened and closed again in a practiced rhythm. The caretakers of the lazaretto, for their precision, they rarely speak, and when they do, it is through thick masks and short sentences. Their goal is not conversation. Their task is to observe, record, and wait. Waiting, in fact, is the main feature of life here. Days blend into one another with almost no distinction. The outside world recedes quickly, replaced by a simple routine of waking, eating, watching, and listening. You are watched through a small hole in the door, sometimes through slits in the wall. You are not told if your condition is improving or worsening. You are not told how many others have come or gone. You simply exist in a kind of suspended judgment, as your body is left to decide the outcome. The daily protocols are strict. You are expected to cleanse your hands and face with the vinegar solution every morning and evening. You must report any signs of fever by tapping on the door 3 times. Should you fail to do so, they will assume you are either improving or no longer breathing. The silence inside the lazaretto is unlike anything outside its walls. There are no bells here except those used to signal death or arrival. There is no music, no marketplace chatter, no call of vendors or echo of distant song. Instead, you hear the creak of carts wheeled slowly down the corridor, their iron wheels rasping against the stone. You hear coughing from other rooms, some sharp and urgent, others fading into low, wet murmurs. And at times, you hear nothing at all. That absence of sound can be the most unsettling. It is in that quiet that thoughts begin to wander. You may recall the face of the man who shared your gondola ride to the island. He was seated across from you, silent and sweating, eyes darting beneath a worn cap. You did not speak. You were not allowed to. You wonder if he's still here in one of these rooms, or if his door is now marked with the quiet cross of finality. Sometimes, someone tries to speak through the walls. A low whisper at night, calling out a name, perhaps asking for water, or simply seeking the comfort of a human voice. Usually the whispers stop quickly. Silence is preferred. Sound carries infection, they believe. Laughter, once a symbol of life, is now seen as reckless. And so people do not sing, do not joke, do not call out. They wait, and waiting becomes its own ritual. In the courtyard outside, which you can glimpse only if you press your cheek to the small, cluttered window, a few figures shuffle from door to door. They carry heavy leather aprons and long sticks with silver hooks. These are not doctors, but handlers. They remove the belongings of the dead. They do not enter the rooms unless ordered. When they do, they burn incense and sprinkle chalk powder in their path. The smoke leaves strange trails in the air, curling into shapes that look almost like letters before dissolving. For meals, there's no choice. You are given bread, dried figs, salted fish, and occasionally wine that tastes of iron. It is enough to keep you from hunger, but never to satisfy. There is a running joke among the few who still speak, whispered between walls, that if the plague doesn't take you, the food surely will. These jokes are never laughed at, only repeated like quiet charms meant to ward off despair. Some patients arrive without symptoms, only fear. They were exposed, perhaps on a boat or in the market. These are the ones who pace their rooms, tapping fingers against the stone, counting the days aloud until they lose track. Others come already coughing, eyes red, skin flushed. These do not pace. They lie still for long stretches, breathing shallowly, dreaming perhaps of better places. Most of the time, the doors to their rooms remain closed longer than others. Then, one day, the door is opened, and someone else is wheeled in. There are no goodbyes here, only quiet replacements. The worst are the nights when the wind changes direction. Then the sea air mixes with the sour odor of sweat and disinfectant, the scent creeping in through gaps in the window frame. It clings to your clothes and hair. Some claim it's the smell of death itself, though others say it's simply the smell of too many people kept in too little space. The truth is no one really knows. Medicine here is limited. There are no cures, only rituals. You are told to chew fennel seeds, to rub thyme oil on your chest, to keep your window open even when it rains. The doctors, if you can call them that, wear bird-like masks filled with herbs. Their robes are waxed to repel moisture. They do not sit beside you or touch your skin. They wave their wands instead, long sticks used to lift your blanket or point at your eyes and mouth. They mutter behind their masks, then disappear down the hall. Sometimes, after they leave, you find lavender leaves scattered near the door. Some say that's a good sign. Others say nothing. Days pass. The scratches on your wall add up. You've begun marking time with pieces of stale bread. The crust's hard enough to carve lines into the stone. You've counted 9, maybe 10. You cannot be sure anymore. But then, one morning, something is different. The masked man who checks on you nods. He opens the door wider than usual. You are told to stand, to breathe deeply. You are handed new clothes, coarse but clean. There's no ceremony, no celebration. You are led down the corridor toward the same dock where you arrived. The gondola is waiting. But this time, the oarsman wears no mask. You have been released, it seems. Or perhaps only transferred. You do not know yet, but the air smells brighter. And the city, beyond the mist, is waiting for your return. Chapter 2. The Black Death and the Island of the Dead. It began the way such things always do, With rumors from faraway places, whispers passed between merchants in low voices over wine and candlelight. A sickness had taken hold in the east. They said something fast and cruel, and soon it had followed the trade routes west, arriving on ships heavy with goods and the unseen passengers that clung to grain sacks and burlap. In a city like Venice, built upon commerce and dependent on the sea, nothing arrived without consequence. The plague came quietly, slipping into the city beneath a gray sky and the creak of sails. The first to fall ill were dock workers, then porters, then vendors who bought fish from the men who had unloaded ships only a day before. People coughed and staggered into corners, feverish and confused, then vanished behind doors marked with chalk. Soon there were too many marks to count. The narrow alleys or calli that once hummed with laughter and shouts became oddly quiet. Shutters were drawn in the middle of the day, and laundry lines that once fluttered with bright linens hung limp and forgotten. The air began to heavier, thicker, as if it carried something more than moisture, and the usual scent of canal water and smoke. When the bells began ringing at odd hours, even the birds seemed to fall silent. Death had arrived, not as a specter in the night, but as a constant presence that filled the streets in the form of carts. Moaning, and the slow tolling of iron, bodies were removed at dusk, when the air cooled and the light faded just enough to soften the horror. They were lifted by men in masks and thick gloves, placed gently into flat-bottomed boats or loaded onto two-wheeled carts that groaned with each step. Entire families vanished within days. One day you'd see a woman selling onions outside a bakery. The next only her stall, overturned and dust-covered, as if her presence had been erased rather than removed. The fear was not just of the disease, but of being near someone who might carry it. Even kindness became suspect. To take in a neighbor, to share bread or wine, was no longer a gesture of goodwill, but an invitation to join them in death. As panic spread, the city's government responded with urgency. Venice was no stranger to crisis. For centuries, it had withstood siege, fire, and flood. But this was different. The enemy had no army, no flag, no voice. It came by breath and touch. In response, the city did what no city had done before. It invented quarantine. The idea, radical at the time, was to separate the sick from the well and to isolate anyone arriving by ship before they ever stepped foot on Venetian soil. Thus was born the concept of the quarantine island, a place apart, outside the city's walls, yet close enough to watch. Lazaretto Vecchio, the first of its kind, stood low and solemn on a patch of land reclaimed from marsh. It had once been a monastery, then a leper colony, and now it would become the threshold between life and loss. The island's walls were thick, its gates narrow, its rooms plain and cold. It was not a hospital, it was a barrier. People were brought there not to be cured, but to be kept away. The number of dead soon outpaced the living who remained healthy. Mass graves were dug just beyond the city's edge, and in some cases bodies were lowered into the canals at night, weighted down and whispered over with hurried prayers. These actions were not born of cruelty, but of exhaustion. There were simply too many. A city that had always boasted its elegance and wealth now fought to maintain dignity among piles of rotting linen, broken sandals, and doorways sealed with wax. Dogs roamed the Cale freely, scavenging what they could. Cats disappeared, either having fled or succumbed. The only constant sound was the creaking of boats and the distant weeping of those who remained. Merchants begged to keep their shops open. Priests rang bells from empty churches. And children were kept indoors for so long that they forgot how sunlight felt on their faces. Food became scarce. Not because the supply was gone, but because the carriers were. Grain sat unclaimed on docks, milk soured in cellars, and the once sweet smell of pastry shops was replaced by vinegar and burning herbs. People turned to rituals, rosemary tucked behind ears, garlic hung above doorways, coins boiled before spending. Some covered their mouths with perfumed cloth, convinced that the air itself had turned evil. In a way, it had. The very thing that made Venice thrive, its openness to the world, had become the channel through which death now flowed. Even the water seemed less forgiving, lapping at the sides of buildings with a new kind of slowness, as if mourning the city it held afloat. Through it all, the government kept records. Meticulous lists were drawn, noting who had died, where they lived, how long they had been ill, and who they had last spoken to. These books were not just for posterity. They were an attempt to map the invisible, to trace the shape of a plague that followed no logic and respected no rank. The Doge himself, once untouchable behind marble walls, now wore gloves and kept his distance. Masks, once decorative and joyful, became something else entirely. The plague, by now, had become more than a disease. It was a presence, something you could feel in the weight of the air and the rhythm of daily life. It lived in the silence between conversations, in the careful way people opened doors with cloth-covered hands, and in the fear behind every pair of eyes glimpsed across the canal. Venice, proud and beautiful, had been brought low not by war or fire, but by something it could not see or understand. The city endured, of course, as it always had, but it was changed, and those who lived through that first great wave of death would never walk its bridges or step into its gondolas without remembering what it had cost to survive. The island of the dead was no longer metaphorical. It was real, visible just across the water, and it reminded everyone who looked toward it that the line between life and death could be drawn with startling ease, and sometimes with little warning at all. Chapter 3. The Plague Doctor's Mask Beak Full of Secrets. He rose before dawn, always before the sun breached the marshy eastern horizon, where sea mist clung to the low rooftops of the lagoon's outermost islands. His bed was a modest one, little more than a cot with coarse linen, and the chamber in which he slept was no warmer than the stone corridor outside. The Plague Doctor did not live in luxury. He lived alone, by necessity and by decree. Each day began with a ritual that had become muscle memory. He opened the shutters briefly to let in the morning air, not to freshen the room, but to allow any lingering vapors to drift away. Then came the slow, practiced dressing. First, the linen undershirt and trousers, soaked in vinegar and dried stiff. Then the waxed leather overcoat, thick and smelling but protective. Over that, the gloves, pulled on with care, as they were his first and final defense against. The boots were next, then the hood, and finally the mask, the great looming beak of Venetian fear and medicine. It was not meant to frighten, though it often did. The mask had glass eye holes and a long curved beak, which the doctor filled with a mixture of dried herbs, spices, and sometimes lavender to calm, mint to sharpen the senses, cloves to cleanse the air, and a touch of rue, thought to ward off corruption. These ingredients served little purpose in stopping the disease, but they gave the illusion of control, and in a world where death arrived without explanation, illusion was powerful. Once dressed, he picked up his staff, a long wooden rod polished smooth by years of use. It was not a weapon, though it could be. It was a tool to point, prod, or maintain distance. With it, he could lift a patient's blanket or test the temperature of a fevered brow without ever touching skin. He rarely spoke. His voice, when used, came muffled through the mask, a ghostly sound that startled children and unsettled adults. But most people didn't want words from him. His presence alone said enough. He was the last visitor most would receive. His rounds began in the city's poorest quarters, the tightly packed alleys where fishermen lived with their families, 6 or 7 to a room. The calli were damp and dark, lined with steps slick with mold and doorways nearly swallowed by vines. In these neighborhoods, his arrival was met with a mix of hope and horror. Mothers would hold their children close, uncertain whether to reveal a fever or hide it. Husbands would glance nervously at the breadwinner in the family, weighing the risk of quarantine against the chance of survival. When the doctor pointed his staff toward a door, it was understood that someone inside would soon be gone, either to the sick house, to the graveyard, or to the long silence of waiting. He moved quickly, not out of haste, but because he had many stops. The plague did not discriminate, and so neither could he. From the docks to the palazzi, from the convent to the counting house, he was summoned everywhere. Wealth made the bed softer, but not the death slower. He inspected symptoms with clinical calm swollen nodes beneath the arms, patches of blackened skin, the shaking chills that preceded delirium. He did not flinch. He did not cry. He had trained for this, or so he told himself. In truth, no training prepared anyone for the daily accumulation of loss. At the end of each visit, he marked the door with chalk, a symbol that changed depending on what he saw. A dot for observation, a line for exposure, a cross for infection. These marks became a grim language of their own, understood by neighbors and feared by all. Once marked, a household was left alone. Food was delivered at a distance. Voices dropped to whispers. The air seemed thicker near those doors, and inside, people waited. Sometimes they recovered. More often, they did not. The plague doctor did not treat in the way modern minds would expect. He did not administer medicine or perform surgery. His job was observation, documentation, and containment. He carried with him a leather-bound book in which he wrote daily reports names, addresses, ages, symptoms, progress, outcomes. The book grew heavier with each passing week, not in weight, but in consequence. He knew that many of the people he recorded would be forgotten within a year, their names washed away by time, their lives reduced to ink on a page. There were those who resented him. Some believed he brought the sickness with him, that his mask was not a shield, but a curse. A few threw stones. One house refused him entry, barring the door with broken chairs. He did not argue. He marked the house and moved on. Days blurred together. Meals were taken standing, bread dipped in sour wine, fruit peeled with gloved hands. He did not remove his mask in public, not even to cough. At night, when he returned to his quarters, he burned his outer garments in a small brazier and washed his skin with lye. Sleep came rarely and never deeply. His dreams were filled with faces, voices, hands reaching for help. He could do so little. Still, he returned each morning to the misty streets, to the families behind shuttered windows, to the children with sunken eyes. He did not ask why. He did not wonder how long it would last. He simply endured. The mask, strange and terrible, became a part of him. Children drew it in the margins of books. Merchants carved it into wood. It appeared in frescoes and graffiti, and the folds of whispered stories passed through the generations. To some, he was a symbol of hope. To others, a walking omen. But to himself, he was only a man doing what little he could in the face of something vast and unknowable. He did not expect praise. He did not receive it. When the plague finally eased, when the bells rang for Thanksgiving instead of mourning, he faded from view. His name was forgotten, but his mask remained, a relic of a time when knowledge faltered, fear ruled. And a silent figure in a beaked mask walked through the dying streets of Venice, alone and unseen, bearing witness. Long before the mask became an icon of plague and panic, it began as an experiment, part practical, and entirely steeped in the limited understanding of disease that physicians in the 17th century possessed. In the absence of modern science, people turned to what they knew: air, vapors, and the belief that foul smells carried death. Miasma, the invisible poison thought to float through dirty streets and unclean bodies, was blamed for the spread of illness. The theory was elegant in its simplicity and utterly wrong, but it was the best framework doctors had. And so, in an effort to shield themselves from death, they designed something that resembled not armor, but theater. The beaked mask, which had since become synonymous with plague doctors, was not born of superstition alone. It was a tool, albeit a misunderstood one. The long beak was not ornamental. It was a built-in filter, an attempt to purify the air before it reached the lungs. Into the cavity of the beak, physicians stuffed a blend of herbs and aromatic materials: rose petals, dried lavender, cloves, mint, juniper berries, and sometimes more exotic spices like cinnamon or camphor. These were meant to overwhelm the senses, to mask the stench of death, and more importantly, to neutralize the supposed toxic airs that carried the plague. The mask's design may appear macabre now, but at the time, it was considered advanced. Along with the beak, the mask included glass eyepieces to shield the eyes, which were thought to be a vulnerable point of entry. The mask attached to a long hooded robe, often made of waxed fabric or leather, forming a barrier that covered the physician from head to toe. Every inch of skin was hidden. Every surface could be wiped clean with vinegar or oil. The outfit was not unlike that of an alchemist or a monk, cloaked in secrecy and ritual. The symbolism of the mask, however, ran deeper than just protection. Over time, it took on a meaning of its own, becoming a figure of dread and fascination. For many Venetians, the doctor in the mask was not just a healer or a harbinger. He was a liminal figure, someone who stood between the living and the dead, not quite of either world. His silence, his hidden face, his slow, deliberate movements, they all gave him an aura of something supernatural. Children would whisper that he could see your soul. Some believed that herbs inside the mask were not only fragrant, but enchanted, each selected with care by apothecaries who followed forgotten rules of fumeral balance and planetary alignment. Certain plants were chosen on Tuesdays, but not Fridays. Some were picked under a full moon. It was not unusual for a plague doctor to visit an herbalist and ask for a blend that included not just dried blooms, but crushed stones or ground coral. These ingredients were not medicinal in the modern sense, but they held symbolic weight. They were protections, offerings, gestures of hope made physical, and in times of hopelessness, hope was medicine enough. The mask also blurred the line between science and theater. It became a character of its own. In some accounts, plague doctors were seen on balconies at night, watching the city in stillness. In others, they moved through alleyways so quietly that people only knew they had passed by the faint rustle of their robes or the strange, sweet scent that lingered after they were gone. Some believed they never truly spoke, but communicated through signs, a tilt of the head or a point of the staff. Others swore they heard their voices in dream, low and distant, like wind passing through the bones of a shipwreck. By the time the worst waves of plague had passed, the mask had already embedded itself in the culture of Venice. Artists began to depict it not just in medical manuscripts, but in woodcuts, paintings, and later in the elaborate costume parades of the Venetian Carnival. There, the mask was transformed again, its terrifying purpose softened by feathers, sequins, and gilded filigree. But beneath the beauty remained a ghost of its origins. Even in celebration, the mask reminded Venetians of the line they had walked. In modern times, The beaked mask is often misunderstood as a medieval relic, though it was not widely used until the 17th century. Its origins are usually credited to Charles Delorme, a French physician who crafted the earliest known version around 1619. His goal was simple protect the physician without limiting their ability to work. And while the design would prove ineffective by today's standards, it was a step forward in the understanding that sickness required more than prayer or sacrifice. It required caution. The mask also served another role that few spoke of openly. It dehumanized the doctor, allowing him to enter spaces filled with pain and panic without absorbing it. To the patients, the mask was frightening, but to the doctor, it was a shield not just against disease, but against despair. Behind the mask, he could endure. Behind the mask, he could remain distant. That distance became essential. Day after day, facing the dying, trying and failing to save them, a physician needed something to hold on to. The mask, strange as it was, became that anchor. It absorbed their sorrow, their fear, their last words. It gave the doctor space to survive. Even now, centuries later, the image of the beaked mask holds a peculiar power. It appears in nightmares and museum displays, in textbooks and masquerade balls. It is both ridiculous and terrifying, grotesque and graceful. It reminds us not only of what we feared, but of how we tried to fight that fear with fabric. And spice, with ink and ritual, with a mask that became something more than just a piece of clothing. It became a symbol of helplessness wrapped in hope. A relic of a time when people did not understand death, but faced it anyway, hidden behind glass eyes and a mouth filled with herbs. And if you find yourself staring at one of these masks today, perhaps behind your display case or on the wall of a forgotten church, take a moment to remember the man who once wore it. Not a monster, not a magician, just a weary soul cloaked in scent and sorrow, trying to survive in a city that smelled of salt, smoke, and silence. Chapter 4. An evening at a masked ball in a merchant palace. The lanterns were already lit when the first guests arrived, their flickering reflections dancing on the canal, rippling surface as gondolas glided silently up to the stone steps of the merchants. It was an unusually still evening, the kind where the lagoon seemed to hold its breath, and the distant bells of San Giorgio could be heard more clearly than usual. The palazzo was a grand one, not ancient by Venetian standards, but dressed to impress, its facade gleaming with recent lime wash, its windows trimmed in silk drapes that billowed outward each time a door opened within. Inside, the staff moved with the quiet efficiency that came from long practice. Servants in muted livery polished the final glass panels on the grand chandelier, lighting each candle with a careful hand and a held breath. Plates had been laid with precision, silverware aligned, wine decanted into waiting crystal. The air smelled faintly of rose oil and beeswax, overlaying something deeper, a tinge of burnt herbs that had been scattered at the door for luck, or perhaps for protection. Tonight's guests were not peasants or priests, but members of Venice's merchant elite, the ones who traded spices from Alexandria, and silks from Antioch, men and women who had grown rich while the rest of the city thinned. They came dressed in brocade and velvet, their shoes lacquered. Their masks fitted not out of medical necessity, but of ceremony, ritual, and perhaps the need to pretend that life was still beautiful. The masks tonight were of every variety: half face, full face, long beaked, feline, floral, metallic. Some wore the traditional botta with its jutting chin and blank features. Others the colombina trimmed in lace and jewels. The anonymity these masks provided was not just playful. It offered distance, a kind of theatrical safety that blurred the lines between the self and the performance. And in these times, a little distance from reality was welcome. Music floated from the upper gallery where a trio of hired musicians tuned their viols and lutes. Beneath the ceiling's painted frescoes, the tune was light, lilting, one of those repetitive dances designed to lull and soothe rather than rouse the spirit. Below, the guests began to move among one another with practiced grace. Gloves were kissed. Greetings were exchanged with nods and slight bows. No one hugged, no one dared. Though unspoken, everyone in the room knew the plague had not vanished. Outside these walls, it lingered like smoke less visible than before, but still caught on the wind, still curled beneath shutters, still whispered in prayers said over sleeping children. Yet tonight, for a few hours, the city's richest citizens would pretend otherwise. Wine flowed freely, dark and spiced with clove, and platters of roasted figs, honeyed almonds, and cured meats were passed between silk sleeves. Conversations danced from trade to fashion to scandal, and now and then laughter burst forth, brief, too loud, too high, but it faded quickly. Laughter was difficult to sustain in a city that had buried so many. At the edge of the ballroom, near a row of leaded glass windows, a group of men spoke in hushed tones, their masks giving no clue to their expressions. One adjusted his cloak with a slow gesture, exposing the gold ring of the silk gild. Another clutched a small vial of perfume to his chest and dabbed it occasionally on his mask's edge. All of them, despite their wealth, had stories. One had lost a cousin. One had locked his daughter in the attic for 3 weeks after she'd coughed during supper. One had bribed a dock official to keep his cargo moving, despite the risk. These men were not cruel. They were simply frightened. Fear had become the city's most valuable currency. In the upstairs rooms, away from the revelry, the host's wife paced the corridor outside her private chamber, her slippers soundless against the mosaic tiles. She had not attended the ball, not because she was unwell, but because she no longer believed in pretense. Her sister had died the month before, and the house still held that quiet grief which flowers and music could not banish. Behind closed doors, she kept her sister's mask, a pale blue velvet creation with embroidered stars. Tucked in a drawer she opened and closed each morning like a ritual. She would not dance tonight. Instead, she sat alone by a narrow window, watching the lanterns bob on the canal and listening to the echoes of laughter that did not reach her heart. Back downstairs, the dance began. Couples paired off with a formality that had little to do with affection and more to do with expectation. The movements were slow, courtly, ritualistic, perfect for a city whose identity was built on performance. As the dancers stepped and turned, the chandeliers cast strange shadows across the room, and the flicker of so many candles gave the illusion that the walls themselves were moving. Behind every mask, a different story waited. A woman in green silk who smiled too broadly had buried 3 children. A man with a jeweled feather tucked behind his ear had not left his palazzo in a month, terrified of air from the street. A musician who plucked at his lute had once served in the plague hospitals before his hands began to shake. All of them wore masks now, not just the physical ones, but the invisible ones that came with surviving a year like this, the masks of composure, of resilience, of denial. Midnight approached, and still the ball continued. A new round of wine was poured, and fresh pastries were brought in from the kitchens, lemon cakes dusted with almond and little fried rings dipped in honey. A few more guests arrived late, cloaked in navy and burgundy, stepping through the doors as if from another world. One of them carried a small dog tucked beneath his arm, and another wore gloves so fine they looked spun from clouds. Yet even they, with their wealth and poise, paused briefly near the entryway, glancing toward the incense, burning discreetly at the threshold. Each person, no matter how bold their costume, still feared the plague. And so they stepped lightly, touched little, and watched one another closely. By the time the music began to slow, by the time the candles began to sputter, the masks had become part of the guests' faces. No one remembered who had arrived first. No one remembered what was said during the last hour. It all blended into a haze of scent and song and careful movements. The ball, like Venice itself, moved forward in a fog of beauty and fear, pageantry and quiet panic. And when the guests finally stepped back into their waiting gondolas and disappeared down the darkened canals, they left behind not just a room warmed by bodies and breath, but the heavy stillness of a place that had tried for a few hours to forget what waited outside. When the music faded and the final chords of the dance dissolved into silence, the guests began to slip away, not abruptly, but like mist drawing back over the water. Their gondolas awaited them, polished black hulls gleaming under the lantern light. And one by one they boarded, clutching their cloaks tightly around them, as if the night air itself might be laced with something invisible. The laughter and applause that had once filled the palazzo thinned to murmurs, then footsteps, then nothing. The chandeliers still burned brightly above the marble floor, casting long golden reflections on the walls. The banquet table remained half covered in crumbs and fruit peels, wine staining the lace runners a shade too close to blood. But the performance was over, and beneath the perfume and velvet, the air had changed. Somewhere outside that glittering palace, a woman was lighting a candle beside a sick child. She had no mask, no silk gown, no hired musicians to lift the heaviness of her thoughts. She had sealed the windows with linen, soaked in vinegar, and stuffed the cracks of the door with rosemary and sage. Our neighbors had stopped speaking to her 3 days ago. She had heard the priest once, his voice low as he passed their door in silence. Now she sat with a bowl of water in her lap, bathing the child's face as gently as she could, whispering stories with a voice that refused to tremble. The city around her did not sleep. Even in the dead of night, it lived and watched and listened. A cat crept through a deserted market square, stepping between overturned crates and fading chalk marks on the ground. The bells of a distant convent rang once, low and sonorous, signaling not the hour, but a passing soul. In a back alley near the fishmonger's district, 2 men in rough wool cloaks hauled a wooden cart down a cobbled path. Its wheels groaned with every turn. The cart held 3 figures wrapped in linen and tied with rope. No one stopped them. No one asked. These were not men of the city's upper ranks. They were plague workers, paid by the week, sometimes by the body. They did not wear the beaked masks of doctors, only cloth tied around their mouths and the dull fatigue of those who had seen too much too quickly. Their hands were chapped and stained, their shoes soaked through. But they moved steadily through the narrow street, doing the work no one else could bear. The alleyways, once lively with merchants calling prices and children darting through crowds, were now hushed. Shutters were nailed closed. Doors were double-bolted. Chalk symbols still lingered on many of them, some smudged, some freshly drawn. A single red line meant someone inside had fallen ill. A red X meant the household was already mourning. Some families tried to wipe them away, to pretend things were normal, but the chalk always returned. It was redrawn by unseen hands in the night, as if the city itself had decided to remember. And yet, even now, parties like the one at the Palazzo continued. Not every night and not as openly as before, but enough to maintain the illusion that life could still be refined, elegant, touched by music. Some said the wealthy held these gatherings out of defiance. Others claimed it was denial, and still others whispered that it was superstition. There were those who believed that beauty itself could ward off death, that if they surrounded themselves with laughter, candles, and sweet perfumes, the plague would pass them by. mistaking them for gods or ghosts. They were not entirely wrong. Disease often moved fastest through the cramped and the poor, where walls were thin and windows broken, where clean water was rare, and the air never truly changed. The rich could afford distance. Their homes were large, their courtyards open. They had servants to fetch water, to burn herbs, to carry messages without touching doorways. But still, the plague crept in. It did not knock. It did not ask. It slipped through cracks and keys and coin purses, and when it arrived, no amount of lace or laughter could send it away. Behind the masks at the ball, many guests knew this. They danced not because they were free of fear, but because the alternative was stillness. And stillness in Venice had begun to feel too much like surrender. A merchant might have twirled his wife across the floor with perfect posture, but in his pocket was a folded letter from a cousin who had died that week in Florence. A noblewoman might have smiled as she accepted a pastry, but in her thoughts were the footsteps she had heard below her window the night before. Footsteps that paused, waited, then moved on. There was always the question, would they stop next time? Would the knock come to their door? In this way, the city existed in two realities. In the lighted rooms of the wealthy, there was warmth, candlelight, music, and silk. Outside, there was cold air, rustling herbs, and the soft hiss of oars pushing through dark water. The divide was not just social, but emotional. The rich lived in performance and the practiced joy of pretending that Venice was still whole. The poor lived in awareness, in the measured pace of survival. Neither group was truly safe. Neither one immune, but the illusion of difference gave comfort to those who could afford it. As the last guest left the palazzo, and the great doors were closed for the night, servants began their final tasks. Candles were snuffed, floors swept, and the lingering scent of rose water scrubbed from the air. In a side chamber, a young maid collected abandoned gloves and half-empty goblets, her movements quiet and practiced. She had watched the dancers from behind a curtain earlier, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She had seen the way the masks shifted when people whispered, the way eyes darted beneath feathers and gold. She had heard the laughter and the lies, and now, as she moved alone through the echoing room, she paused only once, placing her hand gently on the back of a chair where a woman in emerald silk had sat for most of the night. Then she exhaled, picked up the last plate, and vanished into the kitchen. Outside, the fog returned. It rolled in over the lagoon with its usual silence, curling through the alleys and over the rooftops, softening the city into a painting of shadows and lamplight. And in that quiet, Venice waited again. A city of secrets, of masks worn by all, of beauty built atop bones, and of music that never quite drowned out the sound of footsteps echoing far too close. Chapter 5. C.A.N.A. N.A. Candle. Life in a plague alley. At the far edge of Venice, beyond the carved stone bridges and palaces with marble facades, there existed a different kind of street, one not etched into maps or sung about in church choirs. These were the alleys of the forgotten. The tangled corridors of the sestieri where laundry hung low enough to slap a man. S-hat and the walls leaned in so close you could touch both sides with outstretched hands. Here, where the city turned away from its grand portraits, people lived not with art and elegance, but with mildew and instinct. In the time of plague, these alleys grew even narrower, not in width, but in spirit. The spaces seemed to close in with each passing day. Every new death tightened the breath of those who remained. Rats scurried freely, darting between barrels and slipping through drainage holes, carved centuries earlier by masons who had never imagined their stones would outlast entire families. The rats were not feared in the way that disease was feared, but they were watched. Carefully, They were part of the equation, though no one quite knew how. Some claimed they brought the sickness. Others said they simply followed it. But all agreed, when the rats began to gather in unusual numbers, it was a sign to start boiling water and to sleep with a scarf wrapped tightly around the nose. The mornings in these alleys began before the sky brightened. Carts arrived early, their wheels clattering on uneven stones, bringing dried beans, vinegar, bread crusts, and sometimes nothing at all. The vendors who once called out their goods in booming voices now whispered from behind scarves, their eyes darting from face to face. Coins were exchanged with cloth between fingers. No one trusted bare hands. The scent of the alley was a layered thing. It began with salt from the nearby canals, mixed with the sweet rot of fruit left too long in the sun. Over that lay the sharp sting of lye soap used by those who still had the means to scrub. And then always there was the constant ghost of something sour illness. Spoiled wine, the faint copper of rusting tools used to clean the gutters. Women swept constantly, not because it was effective, but because it gave them something to do, some visible act of control in a world slipping through their grasp. They swept the same stones over and over, pushing dirt and leaves into piles that would be scattered again by nightfall. A clean doorstep, they believed, might protect what lay behind it. Whether true or not, it became ritual. Some swept in silence. Others muttered prayers with each motion. Children played less than they once had. They had been warned many times not to run into other courtyards or share pieces of bread with friends. Still, now and then a game of marbles would erupt at the corner of a well, quickly and fiercely played until a parent appeared and snatched the children away with trembling hands. There were always whispers in the alley. Who had fallen ill? Who had recovered? Who had not? People spoke in code, using gestures instead of names. A finger drawn across the brow meant fever. A tap on the nose meant a household had been sealed. If someone was missing for more than 2 days, a flower was left on their doorstep, not as an offering, but as a signal. The alley understood. Its language was ancient and urgent. Life here depended not on laws, but on awareness. At midday, the light struggled to reach the stones. The buildings were too close, the air too thick. Windows opened only a crack, enough to let sound out, but little else. A single sneeze could cause 2 neighbors to retreat behind doors for the rest of the day. Trust, once freely given, was now hoarded like flour. People still helped one another, but cautiously. A loaf of bread might be left on a stoop without knocking. A bucket of clean water would appear beside a sick home, but no one stayed to claim things. Even gossip, once the lifeblood of alleyway conversation, had taken on a different tone. It was softer now, like a ghost telling stories no one truly wanted to hear. The local healer, a woman with hair the color of ash and a voice like dry leaves, still walked the alley each day. She did not wear a mask, but always carried a pouch of rosemary and a bell made of bone. When she stopped at a door, everyone took note. Some said she could sense death before it arrived. Others claimed she simply knew the signs better than most. She rarely spoke. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to change the energy of the street. Her pouch smelled of lavender, cloves, and something unidentifiable, something sharp and metallic, like crushed nettles or old rain. By evening, the alley changed again. The light dimmed. Candles were lit in windows, many of them behind shutters, casting a soft glow that shimmered on the damp stones. Meals were taken in silence, bread dipped in oil, beans soaked in vinegar. The occasional piece of dried fruit if the week had been kind. Conversation was minimal. Voices carried too far, and privacy had become more precious than gold. Outside, the rats moved more boldly. They darted between shadows, stopping occasionally to sniff the air, their eyes gleaming like beads in the dark. Some people placed bowls of water outside, not for kindness, but to see if the rats drank. If they didn't, something was wrong. It was a strange kind of omen, but the alley had learned to listen to such things. Sounds at night were not plentiful, but they were important. A single knock meant help was needed. 2 knocks meant someone had passed. No one used 3. 3 was for the city officials, the ones who came with carts. No one wanted to call them. Their presence brought doors marked in red and homes that stayed sealed forever. And so the people of the alley watched. They listened. They measured the space between coughs and the time it took for water to boil. They spoke softly, stepped carefully, and swept the same stones again and again. They lived not in fear exactly, but in awareness, in the heavy presence of something always nearby, never quite seen, but never gone. And in that narrow world of brick, cloth, and candlelight, they endured 1 hour at a time. By the time the moon rose high over the quiet alleys of Venice, the city had settled into its nighttime rituals. In plague times, the evenings were not for rest as much as for reflection, for small, half-whispered habits that gave the illusion of protection. Doors were locked twice instead of once. Beds were sprinkled with crushed rue or sage, tucked into the corners beneath mattresses or laid across the headboard in careful patterns. In a home just off the Quai dei Fabbri, an elderly woman traced crosses on each window pane with oil, muttering words that were not Latin, but something older, handed down from her mother and her mother's mother. Each night, she whispered the same phrases, always in the same order, as if any deviation might open the door to illness. Her neighbors did not mock her. They had seen too much to doubt what might work. In another alley near the edge of the San Polo district, 3 boys with slingshots hunted rats by candlelight. It had become a kind of game, but one with a deeper purpose. Their parents believed that fewer rats meant fewer deaths, and so the boys roamed barefoot through the alleys, slipping behind crates and barrels, their eyes sharp and their arms quick. Each rat caught was burned in a small pit dug beside the canal, the flames fed with scraps of cloth soaked in oil. No one wanted to touch the bodies for long. Gloves were rare, and superstition had long since replaced science. It wasn't uncommon to see families tossing rosemary into their cooking fires or tying garlands of garlic and laurel above their doorways. One man, a cobbler with crooked hands and a heavy limp, wore a pouch of dried lizards around his neck, convinced they drew out the sickness like a sponge. He claimed he hadn't been ill in 30 years, and people listened, not because they believed him, but because they needed something, anything to hold on to. Candlelight was a constant presence. In the windows, on the steps, even floating in small bowls on canal water, little flames burned behind colored glass or in reused bottles, the wax often mixed with ash or herbs. Some candles were blessed at the church of San Giacomo. Others were simply handmade with whatever materials could be gathered. But their purpose was the same: light in darkness, warmth in fear, a signal to the unseen forces that the home was guarding. The prayers that accompanied these candles were rarely formal. They were not read from books or chanted in unison. Instead, they were breathed, one word at a time, half muttered and half thought, directed not to saints or angels necessarily, but to something larger, an idea, a memory, a hope. Sometimes the prayers were names, sometimes they were apologies, sometimes they were bargains, made quietly with fate, with no expectation of answer. Above the rooftops, the bells still rang. The priests had stopped holding public mass long ago, but they still rang the bells at dawn and dusk, marking time for a city that had lost all sense of rhythm. People listened for them without knowing they were listening. When the bells didn't ring one day in late spring, An old woman began weeping uncontrollably in her doorway, convinced it was a sign that the world had ended. Her family found her hours later, still rocking in place, whispering the names of her grandchildren like a song. Every home had its own stories. A painter who had once worked for the Doge now painted only a red, covering his courtyard walls with abstract shapes that made no sense to others, but seemed to comfort him. A midwife who had delivered more than 200 children now refused to touch anyone, choosing instead to leave bundles of herbs on doorsteps, her hands never seen. A boy who had lost his parents kept pigeons in his attic, feeding them bread and telling them stories each night as if they could remember for him what he was starting to forget. Fear in the alleyways was not loud. It was quiet, slow-moving, embedded in the routines of daily life. People rarely screamed anymore. There was no point. The officials came when they came, and screaming only drew attention. Instead, grief was swallowed. It showed in the way someone looked away too quickly, or how they held a cup with both hands even when it wasn't cold. It was in the way people stopped asking questions, how they stopped saying good morning, how they left gifts outside doors without a word. Even silence had meaning. The sound of sweeping at midnight meant someone was still alive. The absence of it meant something had changed. Dreams became another kind of reality. Children often woke crying, not from nightmares, but from the shock of returning to wakefulness. The line between sleep and sickness had blurred. Parents sat by their beds, whispering stories from a time before, from when the alleys were filled with music and food and the smell of roasted almonds in the morning. These stories became prayers of their own, acts of memory meant to keep the future intact. Some believed the city itself was alive, that the stones remembered every step and the canals listened to every whisper. To walk the alley at night, alone and barefoot, was an act of trust. And so a few brave or foolish souls did it, placing one foot in front of the other as if their breath could change the course of the tide. They carried candles or lanterns, sometimes holding bells or bits of metal to ward off spirits. The night patrols never stopped them. They knew. Everyone knew. That survival was not just about medicine or distance. It was about belief. About persistence. About pretending that each day held some small promise of normalcy. In this way, superstition and ritual became the heartbeat of the alley. Not because they worked, but because they filled the space that science had abandoned. In the absence of cures, people turned to meaning. They drew symbols in chalk, whispered charms into soup, and watched the rats with the attention of priests reading sacred texts. And when the candles finally burned down to stubs, and the city fell fully into shadow, they slept. Not peacefully, not deeply, but enough to rise again, sweep again, whisper again, enough to endure. Chapter 6. The Secret Couriers. Letters across locked quarters. In the heart of plaguer Venice, when voices fell silent and windows remained shuttered for weeks at a time, communication itself became both a danger and a lifeline. Families confined to their homes by decree marked by red chalk and heavy bolts were expected to vanish from the public sphere entirely, and yet people still found ways to speak, to send, to reach. In a city built on canals and secrets, messages took new forms. Some were shouted softly across rooftops. Others passed through baskets lowered by rope. But the most mysterious and resilient of all were the letters folded with care, sealed in wax, and delivered by hands that were rarely seen. These were not letters like the ones sent between ambassadors or noblemen. They bore no titles, no elaborate flourishes or gilded edges. They were scrawled on scraps of reused parchment or torn pages from ledgers, their words often written in a rushed, slanted hand. Ink was precious, and paper even more so. But when grief or desperation demanded expression, people made do with charcoal, berry stains, or the end of a burnt stick. What mattered was not the elegance of the script, but the act of reaching out. One such courier was a boy named Luca, no more than 12, whose narrow frame allowed him to slip through passageways too small for adults. He lived with his grandmother in a boathouse along the Zatter, and each morning before dawn, he would pull on his patched cloak, tuck a satchel under his arm, and disappear into the waking mist. The letters came to him hidden in baskets of laundry, slipped beneath doors, or tied to pigeons too sick to fly. He did not read them. That was the rule. But he felt their weight all the same. Some were stiff from dried tears. Others still smelled of rosewater or tobacco. He would deliver them across the city, always on foot, always quiet, knocking twice before leaving the parcel and retreating into shadow. No payment was ever exchanged in coin. He was given bread, buttons, bits of dried meat. Once, a silver ring too large for his hand. He wore it on a string around his neck and never spoke of it again. There were others like Luca, too. Older boys with names no one knew. Young women with baskets of herbs who were also trusted to carry words alongside nettles and dried lavender. Even some priests, especially the younger ones, risked moving messages from one parish to another, tucking them between the folds of their cassocks. Not every delivery was successful. The patrols watched the marked homes carefully, and if a courier was seen lingering too long, questions were asked. Some were beaten. A few were arrested. Rumors spread of one girl who disappeared entirely after delivering a letter to a house near the old glassworks. Whether she fell ill or simply left the city, no one knew. But her story was retold often, her name whispered as a kind of blessing among those who still dared to deliver. The contents of the letters ranged from simple updates to desperate pleas. A mother might write to her brother in another district, asking for lemons, candles, or clean linen. A father, unable to leave his sealed home, might send a final note to his employer, wrapped in oilskin and folded 3 times. Lovers sent each other promises, their words frantic and full of longing, while children traced their names with unsteady hands, including drawings of boats or birds to show they still remembered the world outside. One particularly well-known note, which later circulated among several couriers like a relic, had only 5 words. We are not yet ghosts. The address was faded. The house had since been boarded shut. No one knew who wrote it or if anyone ever replied, but it became a kind of anthem for the invisible. Inside the sick houses and quarantined homes, writing a letter was more than a task. It was a ritual. Pens were sharpened carefully. Ink was mixed with boiled walnut or scraped charcoal. Pages were folded in deliberate ways, often sealed with wax made from candle drippings. The seal itself was symbolic. Some used family crests. Others pressed coins or thimbles into the soft wax. One woman was said to have sealed every letter with a sprig of thyme bound in red thread, a sign to the recipient that she was still holding on. The act of sending a letter carried risk. Officially, it was discouraged. The plague, many believed, could travel through cloth, parchment, even breath trapped between folds. But people sent them anyway, because silence was worse. A letter, even when dangerous, carried presence. It reminded someone outside the walls that there was still a voice behind the shutters, still a beating heart on the other side of the lock. Couriers developed their own rules to stay safe. Letters were never delivered by hand unless absolutely necessary. Most were placed in specific drop points beneath loose stones, behind shutters, tied to the feet of certain statues, or slid between floorboards at the base of certain walls. Some even used boats to pass messages across canals, folding them into wax bundles and tying them to floating pieces of cork. The recipient would know where to stand, what time to wait, how many knocks to give on the far dock. These systems became lifelines for hundreds of people across Venice. Through them, food was requested, births were announced, Prayers were answered, and death itself was acknowledged. In this shadow city of notes and runners, a parallel Venice emerged, one without the doge, without the pomp, without the ceremony. It was a city made of messages held together not by laws or guards, but by the persistence of connection. Those who wrote letters wrote them with care, because they knew it might be the last thing they ever said. Those who delivered them did so with purpose, because they knew it might be the only thing that kept someone else alive. And those who received them read the words slowly, sometimes aloud, sometimes in tears, sometimes folding the paper over and over just to feel the texture of another person's thought. In a time when touch was forbidden and speech was muffled behind fabric, the written word became a form of salvation. It passed through walls, over water, beneath feet, and through shadows. It told the city what the silence tried to hide, that behind every closed door was someone still hoping to be heard. Chapter 7. The Silent Watchman, Venice's Plague Patrol. Long before the sun rose over the red-tiled rooftops of Venice, before the bells chimed from distant church towers or the canals stirred with the push of oars, they were already moving. The watchmen, cloaked in dark wool and wrapped against the morning chill. These men walked in silence, their boots muffled on the damp stone streets. They came in pairs, never alone, not for safety in the traditional sense, but for observation. One to carry the records, one to carry the chalk. They were not doctors, nor were they guards in the sense of soldiers. They did not shout, nor did they brandish weapons. Yet their presence in the alleyways brought windows slamming shut and footsteps fading behind locked doors. The Plague Patrol, as the people called them, were the city's quiet enforcers, tasked with maintaining a fragile order amid invisible chaos. Their duties were as simple as they were grave: to identify signs of infection, to isolate the ill, to ensure that the dead were accounted for, to record the movement of disease as if it were a tide, swelling and receding through the veins of the city. Each morning, they received their instructions from the health magistrate, office handwritten notes pinned to the interior of the door where they gathered just after dawn. The orders included addresses to visit, names to check, and reports to verify. They memorized the lists. Few carried paper. Too many hands had spread too much death already. Their uniform was deliberate. The long black cloak was treated with wax, thick and stiff at the seams. Beneath it, they wore gloves soaked in vinegar and tucked their faces beneath masks or scarves. Not the grotesque beaked masks of the physicians, but simpler cloths, wrapped tightly across nose and mouth. Their tools were minimal: a piece of red chalk, a small iron bell, a length of cord, and sometimes a crowbar, though that was used only when doors refused to open. It rarely came to that. The people knew better. The patrol's first task was observation. They would walk the narrow paths of the Sestieri, pausing in front of homes that had been marked previously, watching for movement behind shutters or signs of tampering with seals. If a house had been placed under quarantine, the door was to remain bolted from the outside, its lock marked with the date of isolation, and a crude red cross beside it. Occasionally, they would scratch a line below the cross for each day passed, like tally marks on a prison wall. When those lines stopped increasing, they knew to investigate. Sometimes they were greeted at the door by weary faces, residents hoping for release, begging to be inspected and declared clean. Other times, there was no response at all. Those silences were the worst. A sealed house with no reply required intervention. The patrol would knock twice, then again, then once more. If nothing followed, they would unbolt the door and step inside. Slowly, cautiously. The air was always different inside those homes. Heavier, stiller, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath. In some cases, they found bodies, already wrapped in linen by grieving relatives who had fled or locked themselves in separate rooms. In others, the dead were discovered exactly where they had fallen, at tables, beside beds, slumped in chairs near burned-down candles. The watchmen did not linger. They inspected, they recorded, and then they called for the removal cart. When infection was confirmed, they marked the door again, this time with a broader cross, more visible, so no one would approach by accident. In some cases, they marked entire alley entrances, a silent warning to those who might wander too close. The city slowly filled with these signs, red chalk on wood and stone, each mark a memory of what had been lost and what remained inside. It was not all death, though. Occasionally, the patrol delivered good news. A house that had completed its quarantine without symptoms could be reopened. The bolts removed, the chalk scrubbed away. These moments were quiet victories, often met with tears rather than cheers. The survivors rarely spoke. They stepped out blinking into the light like people pulled from another world. The watchmen would nod, say nothing, and continue on. Their work was not about hope. It was about balance. There was an unspoken rule among the patrol: never look too long into someone's eyes. It made the job harder. It made the marks heavier. Distance, like the cloth over their mouths, kept them safe, not from the sickness, but from the sorrow. They moved steadily through the city, passing under archways and over small bridges, navigating by memory and instinct. They learned to read the silence of each district, to sense when a neighborhood had shifted from fear to mourning. They noticed the little things: how a window once open every morning remained closed, how a baker's fire failed to light for 3 days, how a singing voice on a balcony faded mid-song and did not return. These changes told them more than any report. At night, when the bells rang again, and the carts made their final passes through the city, the watchmen returned to their post. They removed their gloves slowly, washed their hands in vinegar, and added their notes to the ledger. The day's record would be reviewed by magistrates and then archived, its numbers added to the growing total. There was no ceremony, no moment of reflection, just the scratch of ink, the closing of a book, and the long silence before dawn. Still, they carried the weight. Each mark they made on a door, each knot tied around the latch, each name noted and crossed out, these things did not fade easily. In quiet moments, alone in the dark corners of their homes, they remembered the faces behind those doors, the sounds that leaked through cracks in the wood, the way a child's toy lay forgotten beside a sealed threshold. And they kept walking, not out of duty alone, but because someone had to. Someone had to mark the doors, count the days, record the living and the lost. Someone had to witness. And so they did, cloaked in black, silent as the alleys they passed through, the last boundary between a city and its vanishing. The patrolmen rarely spoke of what they saw, not to their families, not to one another. Their silence was part of the work, woven into the folds of their cloaks, pressed between the pages of the ledgers they handed over each night. What they witnessed did not belong to conversation. It lingered in glances and gestures, in the way they paused before opening certain doors, or how their hands hesitated just slightly when chalking another mark onto a frame. Over time, they came to recognize patterns. The same alley would call their attention every few days. The same names would appear again and again in the margins of their books, connected to new deaths, new disappearances. Certain corners of the city seemed to breathe more illness than others. These places took on a weight, a heaviness that was not physical, but could be felt in the stillness of the air, the way even cats avoided resting there. And in their quiet way, the patrolmen marked these places in their memories, adjusting their routes to pass more quickly or arrive with a stronger lantern. Sometimes one of their own would fall ill. A patrolman who had worked every shift for weeks might begin coughing. or lose his appetite, or stumble slightly when descending steps he had walked 100 times. When that happened, no one said anything aloud. The man would excuse himself, hand over his satchel, and walk home slowly, often never to return. His name would be added to the log, and someone else would take his place. There were no ceremonies, no badges or final words, only the absence and the weight it left behind. For those who remained, the routine continued. They were expected to show no emotion, to treat each home equally, each name as a line to be copied. But beneath that discipline lay exhaustion, the kind that settled deep in the bones, that turned sleep into a battle and memory into fog. At night, they often dreamed of rows of endless doors, each marked, each waiting to be opened. Behind some lay silence, behind others a sound too soft to place, like weeping or water dripping in a far-off chamber. And in the dream, they walked endlessly, lantern swinging, the chalk in their hand worn to a nub. In quieter hours, they sometimes questioned what would remain, not of the city, but of the people. Would the names in the ledger be remembered? Would anyone know that a woman in Castello had survived 3 children, or that a baker in Dorsaduro had continued baking loaves and leaving them on doorsteps even after his own wife fell ill? Would anyone care that a boy who delivered water to quarantined homes had not missed a day, or that a watchman had sealed a house with his own trembling hand, knowing that inside was his brother? The patrolmen did not ask these things aloud. They did not expect statues or plaques. But in the quiet moments when a fog rolled in and the city seemed to float above its own reflection, they carried these memories like relics. The watchmen were not heroes. They were not priests or healers. They were men given a task, and they did it not for glory or gold, but because someone had to. Without them, the city would have unraveled faster. Doors flung open in confusion, names lost to rumor and fire. Their presence, though rarely welcomed, offered a kind of grim stability. People feared them, yes, but they also relied on them. The sight of the patrol was often the only confirmation that the city still functioned, that someone was watching, recording, remembering, and in a time when so much was lost, that mattered. Even as the worst waves passed and the death carts rolled less frequently, the watchmen continued their rounds. The chalk faded slower. The bells rang less. But they still walked, past windows with shutters now open again, past shops brushing away dust, past families counting the faces at their tables and finding 1 or 2 missing. The patrol no longer needed to mark every door, but they still checked them. The habit had become too ingrained to stop. It was not just duty anymore. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat, a way of saying we are still here. And long after the city returned to music and markets, long after the last quarantine was lifted and the ledgers were stored in their archives beneath the Doge's palace, the watchmen remain remembered not by name, but by the marks they left behind. Faint lines on wood, scratches on stone. Numbers scrawled into the corner of forgotten pages. They vanished as quietly as they had come. Their silence now part of the city itself, stitched into its stones, carried on the tide, waiting just beneath the surface, in case they were ever needed again. Chapter 8. The Peace of San Rocco, Hope Amid Infection. In the quiet desperation of plague-stricken Venice, when even the air seemed to sigh under the weight of fear, the people turned to something older than medicine, older than the city itself. They turned to faith, and not the distant, formal sort that came from golden altars and Latin hymns, but to something personal and urgent, embodied in a figure who walked among them, not in glory, but in humility. San Rocco, patron of plague victims, had long been a quiet presence in Venetian devotion. But during the blackest weeks of a contagion, his image became an anchor. It was not uncommon to see his portrait hastily drawn in charcoal on alley walls, tucked into candlelit niches or carved into the wood of household doors. His story, passed down from mother to child and whispered between neighbors, offered a sliver of comfort in a world that no longer made sense. Born in Montpellier centuries earlier, San Rocco had once walked among the sick during a plague, tending to the dying with his bare hands, refusing fear and accepting illness as the price of love. When he himself grew ill, legend said, he retreated to the forest, where a dog brought him bread each day and licked his wounds until he recovered. It was a story that Venetians knew well, repeated in every district and retold each year during the Feast of San Rocco, a festival that became something more than tradition in plague years. It became necessity. In a city under curfew, with its churches shuttered and bells ringing more often for death than for birth, the feast took on a different form. No grand processions with banners and music, no markets overflowing with sweetbreads and figs. Instead, it became an offering of the people, a day of silence and small acts. Families placed candles in their windows the night before, their flames trembling in the humid air. Some used oil lamps. Others set tiny bowls afloat in the canal, the flickering lights drifting past shuttered homes like fireflies over still water. The streets were hushed, not out of mourning, but out of reverence. Those who still believed, or those who simply had nothing else left to believe in, rose early on the morning of the feast and walked barefoot through the alleys, some in silence, others whispering prayers with each step. They did not gather. That was forbidden, but they moved together, a silent tide of reverence flowing through the bones of the city. The barefoot ritual was rooted in the old belief that humility brought protection, that to walk the city as San Rocco had without shoes, without fear, was to show the plague that you were already laid bare. Along the route to the church of San Rocco, people left offerings, not coins or jewels, for most had none but whatever they could spare. A piece of bread, a bundle of herbs, a single flower picked from a shutter box. These gifts were placed along the walls, collected later by the church brothers, who sorted them carefully, blessing each one before distributing them to the poor. Inside the church, where sunlight filtered through high windows and dust danced above the marble floor, a statue of the saint stood flanked by candles, his carved hand lifted in blessing, his eyes cast downward in compassion. Few were allowed inside at once, but many waited for hours just to stand in the threshold to see the image and cross themselves, whispering the names of the dead into the quiet. The priests did not preach that day. They moved among the people instead, their robes plain, their voices low, offering blessings in the soft cadence of familiarity. They carried vials of rosewater and small wax medallions bearing the saint's likeness, pressing them into the hands of those who knelt, not as cures, but as reminders. Not every district participated. In some corners of the city, where the plague had taken too much and too fast, people could not bring themselves to believe. Their windows remained dark. Their streets were empty. For them, the feast was a memory too painful to reenact. But even there, the name San Rocco is spoken, not in praise, but in longing. In the Castello district, a group of widows dressed in gray sat along the edge of the campo, their bare feet dusty, their fingers clutching rosaries worn smooth by use. They did not speak, only looked ahead, their eyes focused on the bell tower of San Giovanni in Bregora. At noon, they rose together, turned west, and walked back to their homes, never looking back. In Dorsaduro, where artisans and stonemasons had once filled the streets with color and music, a baker placed a loaf of sweet anise bread on the steps of a shuttered home. He did not knock. He only paused for a moment, crossed himself, and walked away. In that simple act, there was more hope than all the sermons ever written. The feast of San Rocco did not stop the plague, but it softened its grip for a day. It gave the city a chance to exhale, to remember that even in the face of relentless death, there were still things that could not be touched: devotion, memory, kindness. And as the sun dipped low over the lagoon, casting the city in gold and shadow, the candles flickered again. This time in the windows of homes where people had once feared to show light. The breeze carried the scent of burning beeswax and rosemary, and from a balcony near the Grand Canal, someone began to hum, not a hymn, just a song. Something old, familiar, full of notes that rose and fell like breath. For a moment, the city felt whole, not healed, but still living. And in that fragile stillness, San Rocco walked once more, not in flesh, but in footsteps, in silence, in flame. The church of San Rocco was not the grandest in Venice. It lacked the gilded opulence of San Marco, or the scale of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Fori, but it possessed something rarer, a presence. Nestled between narrow stone lanes and shaded courtyards, the church rose modestly from its foundations, its white facade catching the light in a way that made it seem to glow softly at dusk. Within its walls, time moved differently. The air was cooler, thick with incense and candle wax, and the sound of footsteps softened instantly upon entry, as if the building itself asked visitors to tread lightly. At the center stood the statue of San Rocco, carved in marble and rendered not in triumph, but in stillness. His face was gentle, not stern, his gaze downward rather than lifted. He bore a pilgrim's staff and bared one leg where a plague sore was shown, as tradition dictated. Yet it was not the wound that drew the eye. It was the hand resting calmly at his side, open as if inviting confession. This church had long been associated with healing, but during the great waves of the plague, it became something deeper, a site of collective memory, a vessel for unspoken sorrow. The story of San Rocco became a mirror for the city's own suffering. He was said to have wandered Italy during a terrible plague, devoting himself to the care of the sick without thought for his own safety. He did not wear armor or bear arms. He had no title or wealth. He carried herbs and water and comforted those who had been abandoned. When he too became ill, he chose not to return to his people, fearing he might infect them. Instead, he withdrew into the forest, prepared to die alone, but he did not die. According to the legend, a dog from a nearby house began bringing him bread each day and licking his wounds. The animal's care, paired with his faith, brought him back from the edge. The image of San Rocco and the dog became iconic in Venice. You could find it carved into door frames, painted above thresholds, even scratched into the underside of bread boards in homes where hope had long since run out. The people did not always pray for deliverance. Sometimes they only asked for comfort, for a little bread, for a dog at their side. The church became a refuge not only for the faithful, but for those who no longer knew what they believed. Priests kept the doors open longer during the worst years, knowing that even those too afraid to speak still needed a place to sit, to watch a candle flicker, to feel the weight of their sorrow ease slightly. They allowed people to leave letters at the foot of the statue, scraps of parchment, pieces of cloth, sometimes even broken rosaries, each one a message without words. They were not read aloud. They were burned in the evenings, the ashes collected and buried in a garden behind the church. That earth was believed to be sacred, though no marker stood above it. Just a bench, a patch of time, and silence. There were those who said the statue wept during the darkest nights. Others claimed that the candles flickered strangely when someone approached with a broken heart. Some heard whispers. Some felt warmth in the coldest hours. The priests never confirmed nor denied such stories. They only nodded, offered a place to sit, and lit another candle. Outside the church, near the narrow campo, vendors sometimes gathered quietly during the feast day, selling images of San Rocco printed on cheap paper or pressed into tin. These tokens were not expensive, but they were cherished. Families placed them above doorways, tucked them into pockets, and hung them above beds. They were meant to protect, but they also served to remember, not just the saint, but the city's endurance. Some claimed the very walls of the church held power. The sick who touched them, they said, would not always be healed, but they would be heard. The desperate who leaned their heads against the cool stone might leave with their sorrow eased just enough to last the night. Whether the stories were true or not hardly mattered. What mattered was the effect. People walked away differently, more slowly, perhaps, or with a gentler gaze. Some with tears, others with dry eyes and trembling hands. All of them carried something from that place that could not be seen but lingered for days. The feast of San Rocco remained the most sacred day in the calendar, not because it promised miracles, but because it honored grief. It acknowledged that loss could be heavy, and that even the strongest faith could bend. During these annual rituals, Venetians did not pretend that death had not come. They walked with it. They brought their memories, their pain, their longing, and stood quietly before a statue that asked nothing but patience. For the children born during the plague years, the church became their first memory of public space. They remembered its cool air, the soft red of the hanging lamps, the rustle of robes as people knelt in prayer. And in the years that followed, long after the plague retreated and the city returned to color and clamor, many returned to that sanctuary, not with sickness, but with questions, with gratitude, with the need to sit in stillness once more. And the statue remained unchanged. San Rocco, with his wound and his dog and his open hand, still welcomed all who came, not as a savior, not even as a saint, but as a reminder that even in the face of relentless loss, there had been kindness. And where there had been kindness, something of the soul had endured. The church remained a sanctuary, a place not of grand pronouncements or roaring faith, but of quiet breath, of shared pain, and of the slow, steady return of hope. Chapter 9. Apothecaries of the Plague, Powder, Wine, and Desperation. Tucked between wine shops and cloth merchants, down shaded lanes where moss climbed the bricks like slow green fire, the apothecaries of Venice remained open even as the city staggered under the weight of plague. Their doorways were often unmarked, their signs faded or coded, an image of a pestle, a crescent moon, a flower pressed between two lines. You did not need directions to find them. Word spread by need. Behind their counters stood men and women with steady hands and lined faces, their robes stained with dust and tincture, their eyes tired but alert. These were not physicians in the traditional sense. They were artisans of medicine, keepers of jars and ledgers, alchemists of the everyday. Their shops smelled of dried herbs and burnt sugar, vinegar and fennel, old beeswax and mold. Shelves groaned under the weight of glass bottles and stone jars, each labeled in careful Latin script or local dialect angelica root. A loose wood, cardamom, myrrh, dried orange peel, camphor, powdered coral. Some items were rare and expensive, smuggled in on ships through disease-ridden ports. Others were local, pulled from gardens behind cloisters or from the wild marshes beyond the city. When the plague came, these shops became places of both fear and hope. Long lines would form in the early hours, people waiting with scarves tied over their mouths, holding coins warm from the clutch of anxious palms. They asked for anything: elixirs, powders, oils, amulets, prayers carved into bark. They asked in hushed voices, glancing sideways as if even the request might spread contagion. The apothecaries offered what they could. Vials of rosewater mixed with crushed pearls, sold as protection for the breath. Doses of theriac, a centuries-old compound made from dozens of ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, honey, and bits of viper flesh, believed to ward off infection if taken daily at dawn. They sold vinegar tinctures to cleanse the skin, wine mixed with rosemary to bathe the feet, cloth sachets filled with dried lavender and wormwood meant to be pinned inside one's mask. There were syrups to soothe the throat, pastes to smear across the chest, and powders to toss into flames, releasing smoke that was said to cleanse a room. Each apothecary had their own secret recipe, a blend passed down or discovered during fevered experimentation. No one asked for proof. There was no proof to give. But the purchases were made, and each transaction brought the buyer a flicker of control. That, more than any potion, was the true salve. One of the most sought-after ingredients was ambergris, scraped from the bellies of whales and believed to hold purifying properties. It was nearly impossible to acquire and price beyond most reach, but its legend alone kept people asking. Some apothecaries replaced it with similar-smelling resins, never confessing the swap. They believed the lie was a kindness. Another favorite was crushed emerald, said to strengthen the heart against sorrow. A single dose cost a month's wages. One shop near Campo San Barnaba became known for its sapphire-toned syrups, sold in tiny glass vials sealed with blue wax. The apothecary who made them claimed he had learned the recipe from a monk who saw angels in his dreams. Whether or not anyone believed him, the syrups always sold out. Not every concoction was so rare. Vinegar of the Four Thieves, a simple mix of herbs steeped in vinegar, became common in nearly every home. Legend said it was used by a band of robbers who stole from plague houses without falling ill. Whether fact or myth, it was poured over doorknobs, sponged onto skin, and soaked into rags hung in windows. Even the scent of it became familiar across the city, a sharp, clean sting that clung to clothes and skin like armor. The apothecaries also kept records. They wrote in small books, each line a mix of ingredients, dates, and notes on effectiveness. Occasionally, they added marks beside certain names, return customers, symptoms reported, outcomes if known. These books were rarely shared, but among themselves, the apothecaries whispered. They traded recipes in the quiet language of survival, always adjusting, always watching. They were not immune to the fear that consumed the city. Several shops were shuttered permanently when the owners fell ill. Others closed for a day after a strange symptom appeared. Reopening with new precautions, counters now lined with cloth soaked in vinegar. Customers kept outside. Transactions handled with tongs or long wooden spoons. Some created delivery systems, sending out runners with gloves and masks, carrying bundles of herbs tied in wax paper. These runners were young boys and girls barely old enough to understand what they risked. But they moved through the city with quick feet, knocking softly, leaving parcels in baskets or on stones, never waiting for thanks. Despite their efforts, there were always moments of doubt. The plague did not respond to logic. A family who used every tincture might fall within days, while a neighbor who trusted nothing but boiled garlic might survive. Still, people returned. They needed the ritual, the familiarity of the jars and shelves, the comforting presence of someone who would listen. Some came only to speak, to describe a new symptom, to ask whether grief could cause fever, or to confess that they were tired of praying. The apothecaries listened. They poured wine, offered small bites of candied ginger, and sometimes shared stories of old outbreaks, trying to make the present seem less final. These shops, filled with smells and soft voices, became sanctuaries for the rational and the desperate alike. In the heart of a dying city, they offered more than medicine. They offered a reason to try again tomorrow. And as the sun set over the domes and canals, the glow of candlelight inside their small rooms flickered on like stars, one jar at a time, each a silent promise that something could still be done. As the plague years dragged on and official knowledge remained uncertain, the line between medicine and magic blurred almost completely. With each passing month, apothecaries in Venice found themselves not only mixing compounds, but also interpreting dreams, diagnosing ailments through scent and color, and prescribing remedies that bore more resemblance to folklore than pharmacology. And yet, in that strange mixture of fear and improvisation, something remarkable happened. Recipes appeared on alley walls and in hastily copied pamphlets that changed hands like currency. One advised boiling a handful of toads in red wine until the liquid turned black, then mixing the result with ashes and spreading it on door frames. Another involved swallowing crushed emerald mixed with goat's milk under moonlight. It was noted that people who worked with fire bakers, glass blowers, blacksmiths seemed to suffer less during certain waves of infection. Some believed it was divine protection. Others thought the smoke kept the plague at bay. But a few apothecaries began advising their patients to steam herbs over boiling water, inhale the vapors, and heat their rooms once daily. It was helplessness. With every dose and vial, they gave the city a reason to hope. And in a time when nothing else was certain, that was medicine enough. Whether or not this directly helped, the act of warming the air, loosening congestion, and cleansing surfaces may well have saved lives. It was never declared an official treatment, but in the alleys and back rooms it became quiet gospel. Yet another suggested thing with a peeled onion tied to the armpit, rotating it each day to the opposite side. Snake oil sellers came, two foreign merchants with glinting eyes and silver tongues, selling bottled miracles from passing boats. And when the worst of the plague passed, when the bells rang less frequently and the watchmen walked fewer streets, many of the remedies remained. Not out of necessity, but out of memory. Recipes were passed to children. Sachets were sewn into wedding gowns. Bottles of pestilence water sat in cupboards long after they were needed. And the apothecaries, those quiet keepers of ancient jars and whispered truths, continued their work, never boasting, never forgetting. They offered powders made of unicorn horn, potions from the east, stones that glowed faintly in the dark. People bought them in desperation, and when they failed, as they always did, the merchant was already gone. Some apothecaries railed against them, posting warnings in the market squares. Others simply shook their heads and focused on their own craft, knowing that desperation was not a symptom. For the hopeless, nothing was too outlandish. They would try anything once. The apothecaries, pragmatic and often bemused, sometimes sold the ingredients without comment. They knew that belief could be as potent as any tonic. Even amid false cures and desperate guesses, a few methods, born of instinct and necessity, turned out to hold real value survival tricks passed quietly from hand to hand, eventually finding their way into the roots of modern medicine. Cloves and cinnamon, for example, were added to almost every remedy, not just for scent, but because they contained mild antiseptic compounds. These pouches were sewn from scraps of linen or silk and filled with combinations of dried herbs, ground citrus peel, amber, camphor, or clove. They were worn close to the skin or tucked into the folds of masks. Some claimed they kept the plague away. Others wore them simply because the scent was comforting in a city that had come to smell vinegar, fear, and decay. The apothecaries sold these by the dozen, often customizing the blends to suit the customer's needs. Some even offered them for free to those who could not pay, tucking them into baskets alongside basic tinctures and loaves of bread. Honey, often used as a binding agent in syrups and pastes, helped soothe inflamed throats, and kept infections from spreading. And then there was garlic strong, pungent, and endlessly recommended. People crushed it into paste, suspended it in vinegar, or hung it in braids over cradles and doors. Long dismissed as folk nonsense, modern historians now credit garlic's sulfuric compounds with offering at least some microbial protection. The people of plague year Venice couldn't explain why it worked. They only knew that those who used it sometimes lived longer. One such example was the use of smoked herbs. It began with superstition, a belief that burning rosemary, sage, and juniper in a sealed room would drive out the evil vapors. At first used for washing hands and faces, it quickly became a sort of catch-all cure. People bathed with it, drank it in diluted form, sprinkled it around beds, and dabbed it behind their ears before leaving home. Apothecaries bottled it by the gallon, pouring it into reused wine flasks and sealing it with wax. Its crisp scent became synonymous with safety. While it couldn't stop the plague, the emphasis on cleanliness it inspired left a legacy far more enduring than anyone expected. Future generations would forget the superstition, but remember the washing. People would light small fires inside copper basins, toss in dried bundles, and walk the perimeter of the room while whispering prayers. Though the reasoning was mystical, the effect was practical. The smoke acted as a natural fumigant, and in the tight, damp houses of Venice where mold and mildew thrived. The practice helped curb the spread of certain airborne bacteria. In time, the city magistrates themselves adopted the custom, instructing public servants to burn specific herbs in plague houses before entering. Another widely accepted tactic was the preparation of pestilence water, a blend of vinegar infused with mint, lavender, rue, and wormwood. Many remedies, however, bordered on the absurd. Still, some of the more bizarre recipes masked surprisingly useful properties. Among the more inventive methods was the use of scent pouches, often carried by those forced to leave home, couriers, patrolmen, even gondoliers. One of the most quietly effective practices of the time came not from a prescription, but from an observation. Of course, not every trick had good intentions. Over time, a strange equilibrium settled. The people learned what to trust, what to avoid, and what simply made them feel less afraid. In the end, it wasn't just the plague they fought. Chapter 10. The Lost Children of the Plague Years. The city was quieter than it had ever been. The bells still rang for the dead, and the gondoliers still rode their soft rhythmic strokes through the canals, but in many of the composts, those broad open squares once alive with merchants and chatter, there was only the sound of small feet. The lost children of Venice moved with a kind of practiced silence. They did not run or shout, as children in other times might. They crept. They listened. They knew which doors to avoid, which alleys still held the smell of sickness, which bridges had been marked with red wax. Their clothes were oversized, often mismatched, the sleeves of a father's tunic dragging across cobbled stone or the hem of a mother's apron tied around a waist much too thin. They did not beg, not in the usual way. To beg would be to speak, and to speak was to invite attention. Instead, they waited beside bakeries where steam curled out of broken windows, mere shuttered fruit stalls where the scent of rot mixed with dried lavender, by doorsteps where bread was sometimes left for no one in particular. They lived in the margins. Some had lost their families slowly, one cough at a time, until the house fell quiet and they were alone. Others had been found wandering long before the bells began tolling, already orphaned by war or poverty, swept into the tide of plague like flotsam on the lagoon. In better times, they might have been taken in by guilds or convents, sent to live with distant relatives or trained as apprentices. But now no one opened their doors. People feared the children even more than the rats, for children bore no symptoms, and yet carried sickness like shadows in their lungs. And so the city watched them with wary eyes, pitying, distant, afraid. Plague doctors, moving stiffly beneath their beaked masks, sometimes paused when they saw them. They didn't speak. A glance? A nod? Occasionally they left packets of dried figs or slips of cloth soaked in rosewater. The children knew better than to follow. They simply waited for the sound of footsteps to fade before scurrying forward, collecting whatever had been left like treasure. Their games were quiet, strange, often shaped by what they had seen. One popular game involved drawing chalk lines on stone and pretending to seal each other into imaginary plague houses. Another required building miniature shrines from broken tiles and coins, whispering the names of the dead and bowing 3 times. Some still fed the pigeons, though less for play and more for habit. The birds clustered in the squares as they always had, cooing softly, their gray wings fluttering as if nothing had changed. The children threw crumbs, stale bits of bread, soft fruit bruised and forgotten. They watched the birds eat with a quiet intensity, as if hoping to understand something from their patterns, their persistence. When food was scarce, some caught the birds instead. They cooked them over candles, feathered them clumsily, and ate in alley corners with a seriousness that robbed the act of cruelty. Hunger had no sentiment. At night, they gathered in places that had once been crowded abandoned chapels. Old gondola docks under the porticos of empty merchant houses. They made fires from crates and sang softly, songs passed down from grandmothers now gone. Lullabies? Mostly. Songs about stars, about rivers, about shoes left on doorsteps. They sang to remember, but also to soothe. Sleep was hard when no one said goodnight. Some children wore charms around their necks, buttons from a mother's coat. Rosaries missing beads, dried flowers pressed between thin layers of wax. One boy wore a strip of velvet tied to his wrist. Another carried a wooden toy with one eye missing. They told stories, too. Not fairy tales, but stories of what they had seen. A house sealed with iron nails. A doctor who knelt and prayed in an alley before entering a home. A girl who walked into the canal one morning and never came out. These were not stories for comfort. They were for remembering, for making sense of a world that had stopped making sense. Some were taken in, eventually. A nun with a soft voice and a white cloth tied over her mouth took 2 girls to live in an empty wing of her convent. An elderly spice merchant adopted the booze who had been sweeping the steps of his shop for weeks. A gondolier, widowed and alone, took in a child he'd found curled in his boat at dawn. But these were rare. Most of the children remained in the in-between, fed by strangers, ignored by law, forgotten by record. They aged quickly, their eyes too old, their games too grim, and yet they survived. They learned to boil water, to recognize the taste of spoiled milk, to hide when the bells rang too close. They learned to comfort each other in whispers and shared crumbs, in the simple closeness of sleeping back to back for warmth. The city carried them like a wound unspoken, unhealed. Years later, when the plague had lifted and the gondolas carried music again, the children remained. Some became apprentices. Some drifted into the lagoon on fishing boats. Some stayed in the alleys now as adults, watching other children play and wondering how they had ever done the same. They remembered the smell of vinegar and candle smoke, the quiet voice of a girl who once told stories about stars, the way pigeons gathered in the morning light. They remembered the silence and the sound of bells that never rang for them. Some of the children who survived the plague years were never meant to live. Their names weren't recorded in church books. No one marked their birthdays. Their homes had collapsed under silence, their parents buried hurriedly or burned without ceremony. And yet these children remained lingering like smoke after a fire, wandering canals and alleys in shoes too large, with eyes too wide. The miracle wasn't that some of them were saved, but that some remembered. Memories of those years clung to them not as singular events, but as constant atmospheres. A boy might grow into a man and still recall the pattern of tiles on the convent floor. Beneath a blanket of borrowed cassocks, a woman might marry and raise children of her own, and still keep beneath her mattress a mask too small for her face, cut from the cloth of her mother's dress. These weren't relics. They were anchors. Many of them refused to speak of those years. In later decades, the city buzzed with rebuilding, with color, with music returning to the palazzos. But the children of the plague carried a quietness that never left them. They had grown up knowing the sound of breath behind doors, of water dripping in empty homes, of coughs that stopped too soon. They had seen gondolas with no passengers drift loose in the night, and had learned to recognize the difference between silence and absence. They knew that a candle blown out too early in the evening meant something had gone wrong behind that shutter. And they knew how to keep going. Some were adopted, not formally, but through quiet arrangements. A fruit seller might leave a fig and a hunk of bread beside his stall every morning, and by afternoon they would be gone, and so would a few coins from his till. He never asked questions. A retired weaver might teach a boy to tie knots and hand him scraps, not because she needed help, but because she remembered the girl who once swept her shop without speaking. These arrangements were built not on duty, but on shared grief. Adults who had lost children gave quietly to children who had lost adults. No promises were made, no adoptions were declared, but lives were stitched together all the same. Those who remained in Venice often became caretakers of forgotten places. They worked in the basements of hospitals, in the bell towers of lesser churches, in archives, in the narrow workshops that made lanterns for the night boats. They had an uncanny memory for the details no one else saw, the alignment of hinges, the way cold crept in through stone, the routes rats took when the water rose. Their knowledge wasn't learned in books. It was lived, imprinted during years when time had seemed both frozen and endless. They moved differently, spoke carefully, and often kept one eye on the sky, as if waiting for something they could never quite name. A few of them did tell their stories, though never all at once. Usually to someone younger, an apprentice, a child, a stranger waiting out a storm. They would speak of the alleys where you had to knock twice before entering. The baker who left warm loaves wrapped in cloth and vanished one morning. The mask that had once belonged to a doctor who never returned, and how they had used it to frighten other children before learning its weight. These stories were shared not for sympathy, but for memory. To mark what had happened, to let someone else carry it forward. One woman, known only as Livia Della Corte, kept a notebook hidden in the drawers of her shop. She had been 6 when the plague came and was taken in by a woman who taught her to blend oils and carve seals. In her later years, Livia wrote down the names of every child she remembered. First names, nicknames, sometimes just a description. The boy with the green hat, the girl who hummed while sweeping, the twins who wore matching rings. No one else knew about the book until after her death. It was found wrapped in linen beneath the floorboards. Her shop was quiet, tucked away in a forgotten corner of Cannaregio. But the notebook now sits in a glass case in the state archives, not for its style or language, for its remembering. These survivors, though few, left traces in subtle ways. A stone bench beneath a fig tree, once the meeting place for a cluster of orphans, now smoothed by generations of footsteps. A mural half hidden behind a market stall, painted by a boy who never learned to write but could replicate, with haunting clarity, the view from the rooftop where he slept during the fever months. A recipe recorded in the margins of a prayer book, taught by a girl who had learned to stretch scraps into soup when nothing else remained. Even the pigeons of Venice, so often dismissed as mere noise, were fed more regularly near certain wells and steps. No one knew why, only that some old men and women insisted on it, tossing crumbs at dusk with a reverence that felt out of place in a city, otherwise so loud. What remained of the lost children were not statues or songs, but habits, stories, and silences. They were never the subject of official memorials. Their faces weren't painted into churches, but Venice remembered them anyway, in the way certain corners of the city fell quiet at night, in the care taken by older gondoliers when they spotted children watching from the bridges, in a scent of rosemary and smoke that lingered in certain homes without reason. They had been shaped by loss, and yet they had survived, not in grand gestures, but in simple persistence. And perhaps that was the truest kind of legacy, not one etched in marble, but one passed quietly, from soul to soul, breath to breath, across time. Chapter 11. The Mask Makers. Behind Venice's painted facers, tucked away in narrow lanes just beyond the noise of the canals, behind a half-curtained window and the faint scent of drying glue, the bottega of the mask maker was a world unto itself. They were worn during Carnival, yes, but also throughout the year by merchants, nobles, lovers, and thieves alike. A man might conduct a secret business deal wearing a mask of black velvet and gold trim. A carnival mask might hide a noble's identity but announce their wealth with every stroke of gold leaf. A plague mask might shield the doctor's breath, but also declare to everyone nearby that sickness was close. Most worked alone, speaking only to customers and apprentices. A priest might ask for one shaped like a skull. Some turned to crafting protective items, nose filters, gloves, thin layers of wax cloth meant to cover mouths. Others returned to the classics, making harlequins and columbinas in miniature, as if hoping to keep the spirit of the city alive, even if only in a drawer. And when the city slowly began to heal, it was the mask makers who saw the first signs of joy returning. A request for a jester's grin. A child's face painted with stars. A couple ordering twin masks for a masked wedding. They watched these orders return like the tide, cautious at first, then bold and bright. A widow might bring her late husband's mask and ask for it to be painted anew, to wear in the next year's procession. And the ones who made them, tucked in their workshops of silence and glue, carried the weight of the city as emotions without ever raising their voices. Their legacy was not carved in stone or written in song, but hung from ceilings, placed gently on faces, carried through alleys and across water. Faces upon faces, each one telling a story no lips would dare speak. The mask maker never asked why. He simply listened, sketched, and worked. But in the quiet of the evening, with his hands stained by pigment and his mind full of faces he'd never seen, he sometimes wondered what would happen to the masks after he was gone. Would they be passed down, displayed, burned, forgotten? They didn't consider themselves artists, though many were. They didn't call themselves healers, though their work touched sickness every day. They were observers, recorders of the city's shifting moods. Through their masks, you could track the year's sentiment. A season heavy with death saw more somber designs, blanks, dark tones, minimal decoration. A year of calm brought back extravagance, peacock feathers, mirrored surfaces, elaborate horns. Every mask, whether meant for carnival or plague duty, carried a trace of the time in which it was made. Even the materials spoke in layers. White clay suggested purity, black velvet hinted at mourning, feathers implied opulence, and red paint so often used in borders or flourishes came to mean danger or desire, depending on the shape of the eye holes and the tilt of the cheek. A woman might slip through alleys in a white bata to escape an arranged courtship. They watched as the mask maker painted lashes with a brush so fine it looked like a strand of hair, or as he glued on lace so delicately it trembled with each breath. Some masks had faces frozen in laughter. Others seemed to frown or weep, though no actual tears were painted. The subtle curve of the mouth, the angle of the brow, expression held in stillness. The children didn't always understand the purpose. To them, the masks were stories. A lion face might be a warrior. A half-moon mask could be a princess cursed to silence. And the beaked masks, they were monsters or guardians or perhaps just men who forgot how to smile. They gave freedom, anonymity, and spectacle, a way to blur the rigid lines of society without tearing them down. But when the plague arrived, masks became something else. No longer just ornaments or flirtations, they were now protection, symbols, weapons against the unseen. And the mask makers, once craftsmen of fashion, became silent participants in survival. It was always dim inside, not dark, but shaded in a way that made the colors of paint and pigments seem deeper, almost suspended in the air. The smell of paper, match, and aged wood filled the room like incense. Long work tables were cluttered with brushes, small knives, and bowls of powdered chalk, ash, bits of rose petal. And overhead, drying on strings strung wall to wall, hung the faces of the city, some grotesque, others serene, each waiting for its wearer, each born from hands that had known both grief and celebration. Before the plague, masks in Venice were tools of mischief and mystery. Each mask began as a mold, often carved from wood and polished smooth by hand. Over this, layers of paper were pressed and pasted, coated with paste made from flour, vinegar, and sometimes ground bone or fish glue. The masks were then dried slowly too fast and they would crack, too slow and they would warp. Once hardened, they were sanded, painted, and adorned. For plague doctors, the process was more somber. The beaked masks required careful shaping, long and narrow, with eye holes often fitted with glass or tinted mica. These were not whimsical disguises. They were tools, part of a uniform meant to create distance between the healer and the dying. Inside the beak, herbs were packed: lavender, mint, cloves, wormwood, and camphor. The scent was meant to block out the miasma of disease, but also perhaps to offer some comfort to the wearer, a reminder of life amid so much death. The mask makers knew the contradictions. They crafted objects that both concealed and revealed. Children sometimes pressed their faces to the shop windows, fascinated by the rows of unfinished masks. In truth, the mask makers themselves rarely smiled. Their work demanded precision, repetition, and above all, quiet. Sometimes the masks were commissioned anonymously. A noblewoman might request a replica of her lover's features. During the worst of the plague, when carnival was cancelled and mourning hung heavy in the air, the mask makers still worked. In Venice, masks were never just masks. They were memory, defense, dream, defiance. When the worst of the plague years finally began to fade, the role of the mask in Venetian life shifted yet. What had once been a symbol of protection, stark, elongated, medicinal, was slowly absorbed into the theater of survival. But to the Venetians who had lived through those long, dim seasons of fear, it was something else entirely. It was reclamation. By turning the beak into something beautiful, by wearing it not with dread, but with elegance, the people asserted control over the past. In salons and marketplaces, in quiet chapels and rowdy taverns, people argued, was it respectful? Some were modeled after the original medical designs, with inner compartments filled not with herbs, but with perfume-soaked cotton. Others played with symbolism. One design had a silver beak split down the middle by a black feather, representing the duality of life and death. Another bore tiny gold roses along the brow, each rose symbolizing a family member lost during the plague. Apprentices learned not only how to shape and paint, but how to read the mood of the city. They snap photos, try them on, and laugh. Few realize that behind the glitter and paint lies a long, quiet history of fear, resilience, and transformation. Few understand that the beaked mask they hold once stood at the threshold between life and death, but the mask makers remember. And through their hands, through their silence, the past breathes on, not in mourning, but in quiet defiance. They were taught that every curve mattered, that a mask must never mock, only reflect. Some apprentices left to start their own shops, taking the legacy with them. Others stayed, quietly shaping history one layer of paper at a time. They preserved not only a craft, but a philosophy, that to wear a mask was not always to hide, but sometimes to remember, to become something ancient, layered, and a little bit sacred. These masks sold slowly at first, then all at once. Was it profane? Was Venice forgetting or transforming? The answers, like the masks themselves, depended on who was wearing them. For some, the beaked mask had become a kind of talisman. They wore it once a year, lit candles for the past, and danced not to forget but to carry forward. For others, it was simply a fashion, no different than a jester's grin or a devil's horns. But for the mask makers, the shift was deeply personal. They were no longer crafting protection. They were shaping memory. They refused to let the plague define them. And so the mask became both memory and armor. Carnival returned, and with it came masks shaped like owls, ravens, serpent symbols that blurred the line between sickness and spectacle. At night, by lantern light, they seemed to float. The effect was haunting. On the final night of Carnival, a masked procession would cross the Grand Canal. The gondolas were lit with candles, their prows trimmed in black. At the head of the line floated a single boat carrying no one. On its floor lay a mask, one of the original style, simple and white. It drifted slowly, pushed by the current, until it disappeared into the night. This ritual had no name, no formal origin, but everyone understood what it meant. Music echoed through the compass, laughter rose from balconies, and all the while, these familiar faces moved silently through the crowd, their expression unreadable. Some saw ghosts. Others saw survival. The plague mask became a costume, a character in a city always on the verge of performance. But not everyone was comfortable with the transformation. The beaked masks of the plague doctors, with their eerie bird-like silhouettes, had left their mark on the collective psyche. They refused to recreate the doctor's beak for entertainment, believing it dishonored those who had worn it in service. Others, however, saw in the transformation a strange kind of tribute. The first carnival masks, fashioned in the style of the plague doctor, were rarely extravagant. They were stark, white, sometimes edged with black. Their beaks were left unadorned. These early versions were not meant to dazzle, but to provoke reflection. People wore them to honor those who had died, to acknowledge the silence that once filled the streets. Over time, however, fashion did what fashion always does. The masks grew bolder. Some were painted in carnival hues, reds, golds, and greens. Others had inscriptions written along the curve of the beak, lines from poems, prayers, names of those lost. Still others were dipped in lacquer, made to shine beneath torchlight. Children who had once cowered at their appearance now mimicked them in play. Artists copied the shape in paintings, dramatists wrote roles for characters that wore them, and mask makers began adapting the design, not for medicine, but for masquerade. The result was unsettling. What had been a harbinger of death now appeared in parades, its profile outlined in silver, feathers replacing herbs, jewels sparkling where glass once shielded weary eyes. To an outsider, this might have seemed like grotesque humor. Some mask makers resisted the trend. There were debates. The bodegas adapted. Shelves once filled with plague remedies now held rows of decorative beaks. Soon, the streets of Carnival glittered with them. The long, ominous silhouettes drifted through the crowds, worn by dancers, actors, even children. A new tradition emerged. Back in the workshops, the mask makers began to pass their knowledge on. Today, when visitors walk through the narrow alleys and spot masks hanging in shop windows, some grinning, some scowling, some shaped like beaked birds, they see only color and charm. There was something sacred about the space between departure and arrival, between the edge of one canal and the rusted steps of the lazaretto. Gondoliers who rode the dying did not speak about it, not even among themselves, but they felt it in their bones. It was a kind of in-between world they entered with each silent passenger. The city seemed different during those rows. The palazzos receded into shadow. The stone bridges loomed like monuments. Monks sometimes emerged from behind the gates, their robes soaked at the hem, faces hidden beneath layers of cloth. Even in grief, they stood tall, their balance perfect, their gaze steady. But those who knew them, wives, brothers, friends, saw the weight. They saw it in the calloused hands that trembled slightly while slicing bread, in the distant look that came over them when church bells rang in the distance, in the way they sometimes paused before tying their boats, staring at the water as if waiting for something to surface. In certain light, beneath certain bridges, the surface seems to shimmer with something just out of reach. Tourists float by in sleek boats, taking photos, unaware that their path once carried the weight of the dying. The gondoliers who row today do not speak of it, but when they touch their oars to the water, when they pass the old lazaretto islands, when the fog rolls in thicker than it should, not as fear, but as presence. There were no spoken greetings. Just gestures, glances, nods. And in that silence, something holy grew. A kind of reverence, a kind of grace. They carried the dead not as burdens, but as passengers. And though their names may be gone, their wake remains, rippling softly through the canals long after the oars have stopped. They could not hear the slap of waves without remembering. There were no statues of the gondoliers who rowed the dying, no plaques on walls, no names in books. But every year, on the same day the carnival ended, a few old men gathered at the edge of the canal beside the church of San Vicaria. They brought candles, floating them out into the water, letting them drift into the lagoon. They never spoke, never organized. They simply came, lit their flames, and watched as the water carried the light away. The locals understood. The visitors did not ask, but most stayed. Venice had a way of binding its people, especially those who had seen its darker depths. And so the gondoliers remained, rowing tourists, delivering goods, guiding brides to weddings and priests to funerals. But something had changed. Even in laughter, there was a distance. Even in music, a pause. The body would be lifted, carried across the stone courtyard, and the gondolier would stand back, watching, until the gate closed again. Some said the island was cursed. Others believed it was holy. But for the gondoliers, it was simply necessary. An old man who tied ribbons to his oar for every soul he ferried, then buried them beneath a fig tree behind his home. A father and son who rode together in silence for months, then disappeared from the city entirely. These were not legends. They were memories passed quietly between families, whispered beside hearths, sometimes told to children too young to understand, but old enough to remember. A place that asked no questions. A place that ended the journey. And the stillness of the water felt almost too deep, as if it could swallow everything they carried, including memory. Every creak of the oar was a kind of prayer. Every glimmer of lantern light on water, a reminder that time moved forward, even if the soul sitting behind them no longer would. Some gondoliers developed small rituals. One tied a red ribbon to his wrist before every journey, then tossed it into the canal once the body was delivered. It sat quietly in the lagoon, surrounded by cypress trees and high walls, its bells muffled by distance. Not everyone was brought there. Many went to mass graves, or to hastily dug trenches on the Lazaretto Islands. But for those with means, or for those whose families refused to forget, San Michel was the final shore. Rowing, there was a longer trip, and the water was more open, exposed to wind and tide. Gondoliers often made the crossing at dawn, when the air was heavy with mist, and the city still asleep. The silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Another kept a pouch of lavender beneath his seat, pressing it between his fingers after each crossing. A few whispered the names of those they carried, if they knew them. Others made them up, giving voices to the silent, restoring names to the nameless. It was not for comfort. It was for duty and for a strange unspoken respect that came only from sharing a boat with someone who would never return. One of the most difficult routes was to the island of San Michel. On arrival, the gondolier would tie off the boat and wait. The toll of this work did not always show. Gondoliers were trained to carry themselves with dignity. A few turned their backs on the water entirely. They left the city, moving inland, finding work in fields or stables or quiet hilltop towns. Their contribution was never formally acknowledged. Some stories survived. A young gondolier who rowed his own brother to the Lazaretto and never rowed again. Even today, the canals remember. The water, always shifting, always carrying, holds traces of that time. The lament of the gondolier was never sung. It was rowed stroke after stroke, breath after breath, across a city that asked too much and gave back only silence. Chapter 13. The night they sealed the gates. There came a night in Venice when the water stood still. The wind forgot to blow, and the bells rang not for vespers, but for warning. In the year 1630, as yet another wave of plague crept across the northern territories. News arrived by boat from inland cities. Padua was groaning under the weight of the sick. Verona had shuttered its churches, and Mantua's streets had emptied overnight. The Venetian Republic, ever proud and fiercely self-preserving, made a decision that would ripple through its marble palaces and crumbling alleys for generations to come. The gates would be sealed, not metaphorically, not as rumor or declaration, but quite literally. That night, under cover of darkness and a rising moon, every entrance to the city was to be locked, every bridge posted with guards, and every route in and out blocked by decree of the Doge and the Senate. The announcement came quietly at first, a series of hand-delivered notes to parish leaders and military captains. But word travels faster than parchment in a city of whispers. Boatmen told vendors, monks told nobles, and soon the streets buzzed with that special kind of panic that only a city surrounded by water can feel. There was nowhere to run. As night fell, families hurried to stock their homes, some knocking on neighbors' doors to share salt, oil, or stories. Others fled in their gondolas, hoping to reach the outer islands before the lockdown. But it was too late. As the moon rose, soldiers took position on the causeways, where the mainland met the marshes. Gates that hadn't been shut in decades groaned on their hinges. Iron bars were slid into place. Canal checkpoints were manned by night watchmen with oil lamps and crossed halberds. Wooden barricades were floated into place on the wider water routes. Even the smallest footbridges in the Castello and San Polo districts were chained, lest anyone attempt to slip away under shadow. And so, for the first time in living memory, the city became a sealed vessel, a floating island adrift and still, dangerous water. The silence that followed was like no other. People stayed indoors, peeking through shutters, clutching rosaries, and whispering what little they understood. Some believed the gates were closed to keep the sickness. Others suspected the truth that the plague was already within, that someone somewhere in the heart of the city had already begun to show signs, that it was too late for escape, and the gates were not protection, but containment. The fear shifted from the outside to the inside, from foreign ships to familiar faces, from a creeping danger to an inescapable fate. Within days, the checkpoints became walls of fear. No one was allowed to pass without papers, and even those were often ignored. Messages were passed by rope from window to window. Food arrived in crates dropped at corners, and coins were left in vinegar-filled buckets to disinfect them. Entire parishes were marked and monitored. Priests made rounds to give last rites through cracked doors. The city, once vibrant with color and cacophony, turned gray and hushed. Even the pigeons seemed to fly lower. One woman, remembered in fragments of neighborhood tailies, lived above a spice shop near the Rialto Bridge. On the night the gates were sealed, she placed candles in all 5 of her windows, each representing a family member who had not returned home. The light burned through the night, and the next, and then stopped. No one ever saw her again. In the weeks that followed, similar flickers of vigil appeared on balconies, beside laundry lines, in chapel corners. They were quiet signals, not of hope, but of presence. Of someone still alive inside. Some Venetians resisted. A few tore down barricades, tried to bribe guards, even attacked checkpoints in desperation. But the city had made its choice. Survival at any cost. The Doge's council issued strict orders. Quarantine violators would be imprisoned or executed. The plague patrols doubled. By midwinter, entire districts had become ghost quarters. Doors nailed shut, windows boarded, silence hanging in the air like frost. Gondoliers refused to enter those canals, not out of cowardice, but because they had seen what lay on the other side of the mist rooms full of unmoving bodies, alleys echoing with unanswered prayers. It wasn't just the poor who suffered. Merchant palaces turned into prisons. Noble families, once separated from the city's grime by silken status, found themselves just as vulnerable. Servants fled, food supplies dwindled, and whispers of sickness inside the palazzos spread like sparks on dry parchment. Some nobles tried to hide their dead, fearing property confiscation or family dishonor. Others abandoned the sick behind locked doors, leaving notes to be read only after they had gone. And yet, amid all this, the gates held. No ship entered, no citizen left. Letters piled up at checkpoints. Trade halted. The lifeblood of Venice, its flow of goods, people, and ideas, was frozen by fear. And still, the plague found its way. It needed no permission, no papers, no gates could bar breath. But something else happened in the stillness. A kind of resolve. As days turned into weeks and the air grew colder, the city began to settle. People adjusted. Routines formed. Bread was baked in shared ovens. Prayers were recited from balconies. Musicians played softly in squares, not for celebration, but to remind neighbors that life still moved behind the stone. Children chalked messages on walls for friends they could not visit. Gondolas delivered not only food, but poetry slips of verse tucked into baskets with lemons and oil. The gates may have held the plague within, but they could not contain the human spirit. Still, no one forgot the night they were sealed. It became a reference point in memory. A line between the world before and the one after. A moment when Venice decided, in a single breath, to close itself off in order to survive. And though the sickness spread regardless, that act, the sealing of the gates, remained a symbol of defiance, of fear, of unity. A city that chose to face its fate not with flight, but with containment. A city that dared to float in silence, hoping the tide would turn. The days after the sealing of the gates took on a rhythm that felt both surreal and inevitable. Each morning arrived with the same gray light filtering through shuttered windows. The same cautious footsteps echoing over damp stone, the same faint cries that seemed to drift without direction. The shock of confinement had given way to something stranger, resigned stillness. Entire neighborhoods existed like islands within the island, cut off from each other not by water but by fear. The checkpoints, once temporary, had taken on the permanence of monuments. Men in dark coats stood beside wooden barricades, faces obscured by cloth, recording the names of the few who passed, often healers, priests, and the rare courier deemed trustworthy enough to carry sealed documents from one quarter to another. It was not silence that defined the city, but the wrong kind of sound. The coughing that came in waves from buildings where candles no longer burned. The clatter of wooden carts wheeled through empty squares to collect bodies, pulled by men whose names would not appear in any civic registry. The scratching of pens in the hands of scribes attempting to track the rising numbers, knowing they would never keep up. And most unsettling of all, the sound of doors being nailed shut from the outside, an unmistakable sequence of hammer blows that turned a home into a tomb. It happened in every district, from San Marco to Dorso Duro, and always without ceremony. 3 knocks, the announcement. Then the hammer, one door, then another. And yet, in this deeply unnatural order, something unexpected blossomed, a kind of ritual care. People who had never spoken to each other before the plague began leaving baskets for their neighbors. Bread wrapped in cloth, dried figs, notes scrawled with verses from the Psalms. Musicians played softly from open windows in the early evenings, not to entertain, but to reassure, to let others know they were still alive. Priests blessed entire neighborhoods from balconies, arms raised high over alleyways that responded with quiet murmurs of Amen. Women leaned out to toss rosemary or orange peels into the canals, not because it did anything, but because it felt like doing something. And the scent of citrus lifted the heart. Inside the homes where sickness had taken hold, the patterns were eerily similar. First, the denial. A cough dismissed as the morning chill. A fever blamed on poor sleep. Then the silence meals uneaten, voices fading, windows left unopened for days. Then the unmistakable red mark painted by patrols onto the doorframe. After that, only silence. Those who survived spoke later of how time bent inside those sealed spaces. A single day felt like a month. Food was rationed to crumbs. Water became holy. People prayed with the fervor of those who knew they would not be heard by anyone but themselves. The watchmen who enforced the quarantine, once resented, became figures of quiet tragedy. These men, recruited from the ranks of the desperate and the debt-bound, had been promised wages and wine. What they received instead was fear and isolation. Each evening, they walked the city with their torches and red paint, marking homes, counting windows, keeping lists that would vanish as quickly as they were written. Some of them began to pray for the families they sealed in. Some left flowers on doorsteps. Others vanished altogether, unable to bear the burden of locking people away and walking on. And still the city held. The gates remained closed. The people within waited first for help, then for mercy, then for an end. Letters to Rome went unanswered. Ships from distant ports remained offshore, their sails furled, their cargo useless. The Doge, hidden in the secure quarters of the ducal palace, issued proclamations from behind thick glass and thick silence. Some called him a coward, others a prisoner like everyone else. Rumors spread of the Senate losing control, of nobles fleeing in disguise, of entire monasteries emptied in the night. Whether true or not, these stories passed from mouth to mouth like kindling, keeping conversation alive in a city where no one wanted to say the truth out loud. Yet Venice was always a city of masks, and never more so than now. People wore faces of calm in public, even as they wept in private. They swept their steps, lit their lanterns, and waved to neighbors across the canal with hands that shook. They read scripture aloud at night, not because they believed, but because the rhythm of the words made the darkness bearable, and still the city endured. By February, the first signs of ebb began to show. Fewer red crosses were painted. Some patrols returned home without finding a new house to seal. Bells tolled less frequently. When the order finally came to unseal the gates, it was met not with celebration, but with unease. People emerged cautiously, blinking in the pale sunlight, unsure of how to move freely again. Some did not emerge at all. Homes were opened to reveal only silence. Rooms turned to dust, gardens grown wild in their containers. No one tallied the full cost. There was no number large enough, no word long enough. The city did not collapse. It simply absorbed the grief like water into stone, quietly, permanently. The gates were unbarred, the causeways reopened, boats returned with merchants and goods and voices. But something in Venice remained altered. The sealing of the city had been more than a measure of health. It had been an act of defiance, of sacrifice, of choosing isolation over annihilation. It worked in part. It failed in part. But in the deep quiet of those months, the city found something it had not expected, its edges. And in knowing those limits, it remembered who it was. No monuments were erected to mark the night the gates closed. But every gate in Venice today, every ancient hinge, carries the weight of that memory. And on certain foggy evenings when the streets grow too still and the bells ring slightly out of tune, you can almost feel it again. That sense of a world paused at its edge, held in place not by walls but by will. Chapter 14. After the Silence. How Venice Remembered. The plague didn't end in a single day. There was no sudden clearing of the air, no proclamation from the Doge declaring the city safe. It ended slowly, like a tide receding, unsure of whether it would return. Palazzos, once filled with family, now stood quiet. Windows shuttered, fountains dry. In San Marco, a merchant's house that had once employed 40 was now occupied by a single gray-haired woman who wandered the halls lighting candles for faces she could no longer picture. Those who survived, who had seen too much, too little, turned to paper. Masses were held with wide spaces between parishioners. Candles were lit for hundreds of names, many of whom had never received last rites. A new committee was formed to study the nature of contagion. Children chalked games onto the stones once again. The smell of bread returned to the alleys, and stories told to children about the time when the city stopped and the canals turned to mirrors. The buildings behind them were cleared out, used for storage, for archives, eventually for nothing at all. The city had endured, not untouched, not unscarred, but enduring nonetheless. The canals still flowed, the bells still rang. And though the alleys were not as full, and the laughter took longer to return, Venice had learned something that would outlive any disease. How to hold grief and beauty in the same breath. How to remember without reopening every wound. How to survive by becoming still, even when the world around it shattered. Grass grew between the stones. Cats took up residence in corners once used for isolation. But no one forgot what those gates had once meant. They were the threshold between the city and everything it tried to lock away. And even as they fell into disrepair, they remained untouchable, like the last page of a chapter, too painful to reread. Some families preserved small relics, a sprig of rosemary pressed in a Bible, a seal from a quarantine letter, a carved wooden bead from a necklace worn until the end. These objects were not shown, but kept passed quietly from hand to hand. Gondolas carried passengers who now asked about who had lived on that corner, who had owned that empty shop. The stories became woven into the stones. Each quiet building became a monument not marked by plaque or pillar, but by memory. They had little understanding, but a growing sense that ignorance had cost them dearly. The city archives expanded, housing thick tomes of death registers, plague protocols, and citizen reports. Scholars visited to study the patterns. Artists arrived to sketch the lazaretto gates. The city, in its quiet way, became both museum and memorial. The city's religious leaders, some of whom had hidden, others who had risked everything, now found themselves reinterpreting their roles. They became not just shepherds, but archivists of grief. Every parish kept a list of the dead. Some were read aloud in public squares. Others were carved into walls, though many names were left off, either forgotten, feared, or never known. Diaries surfaced in kitchens and closets beneath floorboards. Some were detailed accounts, names, dates, symptoms, lists of the lost. Others were chaotic, written in bursts between fevers or in the quiet despair of quarantine. One young woman's journal, found in a boarded-up home in the San Polo district, held pages of poetry scrawled between records of food supplies. She had described the sunrise over her courtyard wall during her final days in isolation, not as a farewell, but as a promise she hoped to keep. Her body was never found, but the notebook was preserved. In Cannaregio, a bakery reopened with only one of its original 5 apprentices. In Castello, children returned to the square where pigeons still gathered, though they played more quietly than before. One morning, a plague bell rang for the last time and was not replaced by another. A week passed with no red crosses painted. A gondolier rode the length of the Grand Canal without seeing a single shutter closed for mourning. These small absences were not celebrated. They were noticed, then whispered, then finally spoken aloud with cautious hope. Still, no one called it over. Not yet. Not until the final fog of winter lifted, revealing the battered edges of a city that had held its breath too long. When people stepped fully into the streets again, they did not return to life as it had been. Too much had changed. Entire parishes were hollowed out. What remained was a city haunted by absence, not in the theatrical sense, but in the everyday. Shoes left outside doors that no longer opened. Letters never picked up from chapels. Unused boats tethered with ropes, now turned stiff with salt. The iron gates of the lazarettos still stood, rust blooming along their hinges. No one rushed to open them. The islands themselves had become symbols, not just of death, but of distance, of all that had been locked away. Some whispered that the wind carried voices across the lagoon at night, that prayers spoken there never stopped echoing. Others simply refused to go near. Venetians began to write. Churches reopened cautiously. Bells that had long gone silent rang with hesitant chimes. The Doge's council, too, changed. Laws were passed to improve quarantine procedures, sanitation, and record keeping, but not everything turned to solemnity. Life, stubborn as the sea, returned. Markets reopened, though voices remained hushed. Weddings were held with empty chairs for the absent. And so Venice remembered in fragments, in oil paintings that showed carnival masks with eyes just a little too sad, in songs with verses added about silence and distance. The iron gates of the lazarettos were never fully dismantled. They were too heavy, too symbolic. In time, rust made them permanent. When night fell over the city, now free from plague, it brought not the terror of silence, but a kind of hush that felt earned. Venice's memory of the plague did not live solely in books or stories or even in the fading names scratched into church walls. It endured in the very way the city moved, in how gondoliers fell silent when passing the old quarantine islands. They would see the grandeur, the golden mosaics of San Marco, the elegance of the Doge's palace, the beauty of canals curling like silver ribbons between ancient homes. Families who had lost entire generations left their homes behind, sold them to strangers, or passed them to monasteries in exchange for prayers. They occurred at twilight, with candlelight and soft music, led by priests who understood they were not just performing ritual, but tending to memory. In time, new windows were added to homes smaller, higher, easier to shutter in an emergency. Courtyards became more common, offering private air and space for healing. Public wells were rebuilt with covers and grates to protect the water from contamination. But Venice never stopped marking time by what had happened. In schools, children were taught about the Black Death, not just through numbers or dates, but through stories of their own ancestors, midwives who stayed behind, sailors who brought the sickness unknowingly, scribes who recorded every death without losing their hand's strength. Every Venetian family, it seemed, carried at least one such story. And so, when another illness threatened generations later, Venetians responded not with surprise, but with memory. They remembered how to be still, how to endure. Some bridges gained small side niches where letters could be passed without contact, a practice born in fear and continued in habit. The lazarettos became overgrown, then half forgotten, then restored as historical sites. Tours were offered. Scholars arrived. But the people of Venice never truly needed to see the buildings to understand their meaning. They had always carried them inside. In how they paused before shaking a stranger's hand. In how they cleaned their windows during festival season. In how they lit candles not just for saints, but for neighbors whose names had become prayer. These changes were not dramatic, but they shifted how the city breathed, how it sheltered its people, how it prepared for what might come again. Find a quiet place near the water. Let the cold air touch your face. Listen, you might hear nothing at all. Or you might hear everything, the whisper of a gondola's oar, the hush of wind against stone, the memory of a name once spoken through a locked door. This is how Venice remembers, not in marble, but in silence. Not in noise, but in the rhythm of life that endures. Lists of names recovered from dusty archives were read in steady voices, names of apothecaries, gondoliers, nurses, children, nobles, and the unknown. Even joyful memories, weddings, births, festivals, were counted alongside who was absent, who was missed, who was once there and then gone. This was not morbid. It was honest. It was the rhythm of a city that had learned to live with loss, not as interruption, but as constant companion. Grandmothers told children bedtime stories with warnings folded into them. Musicians composed elegies that were later transformed into carnival melodies. Pain did not vanish. It was dressed in lace and gold, made part of the dance. Some of the names were incomplete. Some were followed by a silence where no one knew what to say. But they were spoken anyway, and in being spoken they were returned, if only for a moment. Artisans began etching symbols into their shop signs. Tiny birds, suns, and crescents meant to ward off illness or bring luck. A habit that continued long after people stopped believing in its power. Bridges that had once served as barriers were reopened, but a kind of invisible line remained. Even today, there are streets where locals speak more softly, where festivals avoid passing through, as if the air remembers too well. That special kind of Venetian silence that had nothing to do with quiet and everything to do with memory. The silence of fog rolling across the lagoon. The silence of the bells when they chose not to ring. The silence of canals at night when the moon floats undisturbed and every ripple seems to carry voices from long ago. In that stillness, the city did not forget. It listened. It remembered. They would ride in gondolas, photograph masks, sip espresso in sunlit squares. And yet, if they stayed long enough, if they wandered away from the crowds and into the older quarters, they might feel it, the lingering presence of what Venice endured. Not as fear, but as weight, as the stillness between sounds, as the hush that lingers after bells stop ringing, in how older residents avoided certain alleys without explaining why, in how some windows bricked over during those terrible months were never reopened, as if letting light in might also let the past return. There were no grand museums dedicated solely to the Black Death in Venice, no towering monuments of bronze or marble. The remembrance lived in quiet details. A rusted iron ring on a stone wall once used to tie off plague boats. A small painting in a side chapel depicting St. Rocco shielding the sick, the faint red shadow of a painted cross that time and weather had not completely erased. Visitors to the city might not notice these remnants. Some neighborhoods never fully recovered. Others slowly filled again with life, though never in the same way. The churches of Venice became keepers of the city's grief. Masses were held annually in honor of the dead. These services were not publicized or grand. The plague also left its mark on the city's architecture. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the plague years was in the way Venetians told their stories. No tale was told without a shadow. And yet, out of all the echoes that remained, it was the stillness that stayed longest. Centuries passed. The plague returned in smaller waves, then eventually vanished. New fears replaced old ones. The quarantine gates on the islands rusted shut. Today, if you visit Venice in winter, when the crowds have thinned and the fog is thick, walk toward the edge of the lagoon. Now, as the waters of history still once more around us, and the gondola of memory drifts toward its mooring, we leave behind the echoing alleys and mist-veiled canals of a city that survived one of the darkest chapters of human existence. The plague years in Venice were not just a moment in time, they were a transformation, a reshaping of life itself, one slow toll of the bell at a time. From silent sick houses and shuttered palazzos to hidden letters and rusted gates, the city remembered not through loud declarations, but through the hush of survival. It didn't rebuild loudly. It didn't boast of endurance. It simply continued. Brick by brick, boat by boat, breath by breath. Venice, with all its fragility, taught us something quiet and essential. That the human spirit, even when trapped behind stone walls or beneath feathered masks, finds its way to endure. That sorrow does not always scream. Sometimes it just lingers gently in a room. And that even in isolation, perhaps, especially there, we're never truly alone. Because memory, even the painful kind, links us together across time like the canals that stitched the islands of the city into a whole. You've walked with us through candlelit nights, past plague patrols and gondoliers rowing through silence. You've stood at the gates of the lazaretto, watched them swing shut, and waited for the first sign of spring. And now, as we reach the quiet coda of our journey, you can let those heavy doors close behind you. There is comfort in knowing that the worst did pass, that the bells eventually rang again for weddings and not for warning. That bread was once more broken at crowded tables. That music returned to echo through stone courtyards. And that laughter, hesitant at first, made its way back to the piazzas. Though not all who left those alleys returned, their absence became part of the city's fabric. Remember not in tragedy, but in continued life. That is the strange and beautiful truth of history. It survives by being lived again, in quieter ways, by those who never met its first witnesses. So now, as you settle into sleep, imagine yourself adrift on a still Venetian canal. The oar barely touches the water, gliding you through reflections of soft lantern light. Above you, a shutter creaks open. Somewhere, a cat pads silently across a rooftop. A bell chimes from a distant tower, not for alarm, but for time itself. The city around you is older than memory and quieter than breath, and it carries you gently forward. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on the surface of the lagoon. Let the stillness wrap around you like a shawl of sea-woven mist. You're not in danger now. The sickness is long gone. The iron gates are open, rusted over, meaningless now. The candles have all burned low. The prayers have become echoes. The silence that remains is not fearful, but peaceful. It is the sound of a city resting, of a people who have endured, of time letting go. Perhaps that's what Venice teaches best, not how to fight against the tide, but how to float through it. These still canals, these quiet stones, this city that learned long ago how to carry sorrow in silence and beauty in brokenness. Sleep now. You've seen enough for one night. The past is still. The waters are calm. And Venice, forever afloat, drifts with you toward morning. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.